Come in close, friend. Welcome back to Old Man Midnight, where the fire's warm and the rain won't quit. Subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Now settle in. Pull the blanket up. Close your eyes if you want. We've got a long night ahead of us, and I've got 5 stories to tell. Rest easy now. Here we go. Story 1. This one came in a letter I received back in '73, though the events of it happened a year or so before that. The man who wrote it to me was named Ellis Carver, and Ellis was, by all accounts, a fine rural postal carrier out of a little unincorporated stretch of eastern Kentucky, up in the hollers past Hazard, where the roads narrow into 2 ruts of red mud and the trees close over the top of you like the ribs of some sleeping thing. Now listen close. This is how it happened, best as I can tell it. Ellis Carver was 48 years old the winter it began, a widower for 7 years by then, living alone in a squat clapboard cabin his grandfather had built with hand-hewn timbers back before the First War. He kept the place tidy, the way solitary men often do when they have nothing left to distract them from the small rituals of housekeeping. Coffee at 5 in the morning, boots by the door, uniform pressed the night before and hung on a wooden peg. He walked the same route 6 days a week for 21 years, and there wasn't a single mailbox on his run. He couldn't have found in the dark with his eyes closed. He knew every dog on the route. He knew which houses left him a jar of preserves at Christmas and which ones pretended not to be home when the tax notices came through. He knew that the widow Halloway's porch light burned all night because she was afraid of what came up out of the hollow after dark, and he knew that old Mr. Pruitt down at the fork read every piece of junk mail cover to cover because his eyes were going, and he'd rather squint at a supermarket flyer than admit it. He knew all of this the way a man knows the shape of his own hands. His routine, then, was a comfort to him. He rose in the dark. He drank his coffee black. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the ridge line come slow out of the blue. He pulled on his wool socks and his heavy leather boots, a good pair, the same pair he'd worn for 11 years, resoled twice, oiled every Sunday evening while the radio played whatever they had on Sunday evenings back then. He'd shrug into the gray postal coat, take up his satchel, walk out to his little green pickup, and turn the key. The engine caught on the second try, the way it always did in cold weather. He'd drive down to the sorting office in town, pick up his sacks, and begin. The routine was the routine. The routine was Ellis Carver. It was on a Tuesday in late October that the routine first shifted. He noticed it the way you notice a picture on the wall hanging half an inch crooked. Not immediately, and not with alarm, but with a low itch at the back of your mind that says something in this room is not quite where you left it. The itch that first morning was this. When he came down the stairs at 5:10, his boots were by the door where he'd left them. That was normal. But there was a second pair beside them. They were his boots. There was no doubt about it. Same size, same worn-through place on the right toe where he'd caught it on a fence wire in 1964. Same double-knotted laces on the left one. Same soft crease across the ankle from 21 years of the same walk. 2 pair, sitting side by side. Both of them, his Ellis, stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time. He looked at the boots. He looked at the door. He looked at the boots again. Then, because he was a practical man, and it was cold and he had a route to run, he shook his head, muttered something about getting old, and told himself he must have brought a spare pair down the night before and forgot. He put on the first pair, left the second pair by the door, and went to work. By noon, he'd stopped thinking about it. By supper, he'd forgotten it entirely. The next morning, both pairs of boots were still there, and a third pair had joined them. Now, Ellis Carver was not a nervous man. He'd been in the Pacific in the Second War, and he'd seen things he did not talk about, not even to his wife when she was still living. He was not the sort to be undone by a curiosity, and the third pair of boots, sitting there in a neat row with the other two, was not enough to undo him, but it was enough to hold his attention. He crouched down and examined them, one by one. Same wear pattern, same crease, same fence wire scuff on the right toe of each pair. He picked up the third pair and turned it over in his hands. The leather was warm, just slightly, as though it had been sitting near a stove, or as though something had just recently been wearing it. He set it back down. He put on the first pair. He went to work. That day on the route, something felt off, though he couldn't have told you what. The dogs at the Wallace place didn't come out to bark at him. The widow Halloway didn't wave from her porch. Old Mr. Pruitt's mailbox was empty when he opened it to slide the day's post in, which was strange because Mr. Pruitt always had at least one letter waiting to go out, addressed in his shaky hand to a daughter in Cincinnati who, Ellis suspected, had died some years back and simply hadn't had the heart to tell her father. Ellis stood at the fork by Pruitt's mailbox for a long minute, listening. There was no wind. The trees were not moving. He could not hear a single bird. He drove home earlier than usual and made himself a supper of cornbread and beans and did not eat much of either. On the third morning, there were 7 pairs of boots by the door. He counted them twice. 7, all his, all identical in every particular. They were arranged neatly, toe to toe, in a small semicircle facing the base of the stairs, as though someone had set them out to greet him. He stood on the third step and looked down at them for what felt like a long while. His hand, without his telling it to, went to the banister and gripped it hard. He went back upstairs. He sat on the edge of his bed. He put his head in his hands. The rational thing to do, of course, was to check the house. So he did. He checked every closet. He checked under the bed. He checked the crawl space beneath the porch with a flashlight, on his knees in his long underwear at 5:30 in the morning. He found nothing. No footprints in the dust. No sign of forced entry. The back door still had the little wedge of paper he always jammed under it at night, undisturbed. The windows were all latched. He was alone. He had been alone all night. He was certain of it. He went back to the front room. The boots were still there. 7 pairs. He drove the route that day like a man in a trance. He does not, in his letter to me, remember many of the deliveries. He remembers that at one point, coming around the curve above the old Sawyer place, he thought he saw himself walking on the far shoulder of the road in his gray postal coat, carrying his satchel. The figure did not look up as the truck passed. Ellis says he did not slow down. He did not stop. He drove home, and he did not sleep that night. On the 4th morning, he came downstairs slow, one step at a time, and made himself look. Before he reached the bottom, the boots were gone, every last pair. Even the pair he'd been wearing on the route the day before, which he'd set by the door the night before as always. Gone. The front room was empty. The hooks were bare. There wasn't so much as a scuff of dried mud on the floorboards to say the boots had ever been there. Ellis stood in his sock feet in the middle of that empty room, and for the first time since his wife had died, he felt afraid. Not the kind of afraid you feel in the woods when you hear a branch snap. Not the kind of afraid you feel in a foxhole, a different kind. The kind that hollows you out from the inside and leaves the shell of you standing in the middle of your own front room, listening to the rain start on the roof, and knowing, without knowing how you know, that whatever this is, it isn't finished with you yet. He called in sick that day. First time in 11 years, he told Doreen at the sorting office he had a fever, which was almost true. He was sweating and he was cold at the same time, and he sat in his kitchen with a shotgun across his knees, and he watched the front door until the light went out of the sky. True. Nothing came through the door. That night, when he finally climbed the stairs to bed, exhausted past the point of thinking, he stopped on the landing. There was a sound coming from his bedroom, a soft sound, a regular sound. It took him a moment to place it, and when he did, the shotgun almost dropped from his hands. It was the sound of breathing. He stood on that landing for a long time, listening. The breathing was slow, even. It had the particular rhythm of a man in deep sleep, the small catch at the end of each inhale that Ellis had heard from his own wife across 22 years of marriage, that he had heard from himself once, playing back on a tape recorder his nephew had given him one Christmas. It was the breathing of a man asleep, and it was coming from his own bed. He raised the shotgun. He walked forward. He pushed the door open with the barrel. The room was empty. The bed was made, corners tucked the way he always tucked them, quilt smoothed flat. There was no one in it. There was no one under it. There was no one in the closet, or behind the door, or standing in the corner where the shadows pooled deepest. But the breathing did not stop. It went on, soft and steady, from the empty bed, as though someone were lying there, sleeping, exactly where Ellis lay every night. He backed out of the room. He closed the door. He went downstairs, and he slept in his kitchen chair with the shotgun across his lap, and he did not sleep well. Over the next weeks, the strangeness settled into a kind of pattern, and this, Ellis wrote to me, was almost worse than the shock of the beginning, because a pattern is a thing you can get used to, and a man can get used to almost anything. Given enough time and enough tiredness, the boots would appear and disappear at random. Sometimes 2 pair, sometimes 10. Once he came down to find every horizontal surface in the front room. The mantel, the sideboard, the arms of the chairs, the top of the wood stove, crowded with pair upon pair of his boots, all facing the door, as if waiting to walk out. The breathing came every night, always from his bedroom. Always when he was not in it, he began to see the second man, not clearly, not up close, at a distance on the road ahead of him, in the reflection of a shop window as he passed on the sidewalk. Once, standing at the end of Pruitt's driveway with his back to Ellis's truck, in a gray postal coat, holding a satchel. Ellis stopped the truck that time. He got out. He walked toward the figure. When he was 10 feet away, the figure turned its head, just slightly, just enough for Ellis to see the profile. It was his own face. Ellis got back in the truck. He drove home. He did not run the rest of the route that day. He tried at first to tell someone. He tried his sister on the telephone, and she said he was working too hard and needed a rest. He tried the young preacher at the Baptist church down in town, and the preacher said grief did strange things to a man, and had he considered joining the men's Bible study on Wednesday nights. And Ellis said he would think about it, and he hung up. He did not try anyone else. In a place like that holler, in a time like that, a man learns quick which things are said and which are kept. The winter deepened. The snows came. The root grew harder. And on a morning in February, when the ridge was blue-white with new snow and the air was still and cold and smelling of wood smoke, Ellis Carver came down the stairs and found the front room empty. No boots, no sound, no breath. Just the quiet of a house in winter. He allowed himself, for the first time in months, to hope. He walked to the front door. He turned the knob. He stepped out onto the porch, and he stopped. There were footprints in the snow. His footprints, his boot tread, the fence wire scuff and all, coming up the porch steps and stopping at the door. Not going, coming, as though somebody wearing his boots had walked up onto the porch in the night and stood at the door and never left. He looked down. The prints stopped at his own feet, exactly at his own feet, so that his boots, in that moment, sat in the exact impressions the other prints had ended in, matched to the millimeter. He stood there a long time, cold. The cold got into his coat. His breath, which he could see, made a small pale cloud in front of him. It occurred to him then that the breathing in the bedroom had stopped a few nights back. It occurred to him that he had not seen his double on the road for a week or more. It occurred to him that the second pair of boots had never come back. Since that morning, he'd stepped out onto the porch and looked down at prints that had come and had not gone. He went back inside. He hung up his coat. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, and he watched the light change on the ridge. And he thought about it for a long time. And here's the part of the letter, friend, that has stayed with me these 40 and some years. Ellis wrote that afternoon, and this is close enough to his exact words as I remember them. I have come to think the second man was not visiting me. I have come to think the second man arrived and stayed, and that what walked back into my house on the morning I stepped out onto the porch was not the same Ellis who had stepped out. I do not know how to prove this. My hands look like my hands. My name is my name. The root is the root. My sister says I sound the same on the telephone, but I do not remember my wife's face as clearly as I used to. I do not remember the smell of her hair. I do not remember the sound she made when she laughed. I remember only that I loved her in the abstract, the way you remember loving a country you have not visited in a long time. He kept walking the route. He kept sorting the mail. He kept oiling his boots on Sunday evenings while the radio played. He wrote to me the following spring, and after that letter, I never heard from him again. I passed through that holler once, some years later, on a trip east. The little clapboard cabin was still there. The mailbox at the road still had the name Carver on it, faded but legible. I did not stop. I do not know, to this day, whether the man walking the route up there was the man who wrote me the letter or the other one. Maybe there is no difference now. Maybe there never was. But I'll tell you this, friend, some nights when the rain is coming down like it is tonight, and the fire is low, and the house is quiet the way an old house gets quiet, I think about Ellis Carver. I think about the second pair of boots. I think about footprints that come up onto a porch and do not go back down. And I check, before I turn in for the night, that my own boots by the door are the same ones I put there. just the one pair, just mine. So far, they always have been, but the night is long, and I do not always sleep as easy as I used to. Let me tell you a little more about Ellis Carver, friend, because you can't understand what happened to him without first understanding the shape of the life it happened inside of. And the shape of Ellis Carver's life by that October of 1972 was the shape of a man who had made peace with smallness. He got up at 4:30 every morning. The alarm was a wind-up clock his wife had bought at a Sears in Lexington in 1959, and the bell on it was tinny and mean, and he loved it because she had chosen it. He would sit on the edge of the bed for a full minute, sometimes two, staring at his sock feet on the cold floorboards, waiting for the day to arrange itself in his mind. Then he would get up and pull on the flannel robe his sister had knitted him one Christmas, and go down the narrow wood stairs and start the coffee. The coffee pot was a percolator, blue enamel with a chip on the lid. The coffee itself was Folgers, always Folgers, from a can on the second shelf of the pantry. He measured it with a tablespoon that had come from his mother's kitchen. 6 tablespoons for a full pot, never 5, never 7. While the coffee percolated, he would stand at the kitchen window and watch the ridge. The ridge behind the cabin was 340 feet high, and it ran east-west, and the sky above it would go from black to blue to gray to the first pale wash of dawn in a slow, always different way. Ellis had watched that ridge come out of the dark for 21 years, and he had never once seen it do it exactly the same way twice. It was one of the small facts of his life that gave him a private satisfaction. He was not a religious man. He was not, in truth, a philosophical man. But he had this. Every morning, a ridge coming slow out of the blue. Then he would sit at the little formica table by the window and drink the first cup of coffee slow, and eat a piece of toast and read yesterday's newspaper, because today's would not come until he brought it himself. He would butter the toast with a knife that had a bone handle. He would fold the paper the way his father had folded it. He would rinse the cup and set it upside down on the drain board. This is what a life gets to be at 48, when the wife is 7 years gone and the children were never given. This is what a life gets to be. Then the boots, then the coat, then the pickup, then the road. The pickup was a 1968 Chevrolet, green, with a dent in the tailgate from a deer that had come out of a fog one November and had walked, not run, in front of him. He had swerved. The deer had turned its head and looked at him without alarm, and had gone on into the trees on the far side of the road. He had told this story at the sorting office, and nobody had believed him. He had not told it since. The sorting office was a low cinder block building at the edge of town, painted a shade of yellow that must have looked cheerful in 1952 and had, by the time of our story, gone the color of an old man's teeth. Doreen ran the counter. Doreen had run the counter for as long as anybody could remember. She wore reading glasses on a chain, and she smoked a cigarette out the back door on her breaks, and she called every man in the county honey, without meaning anything much by it. Ellis would come in. He would sign the log. He would take his sacks. He would nod to Doreen. Doreen would say, "Morning, honey. Drive careful. The road's icy up past the fork," and she would be right. She always was. There was some part of Doreen, Ellis sometimes thought, that could feel the road out in the county the way a spider feels its web, and knew where the ice was and where the slush was, and where a tree had come down in the night. He had never asked her about it. Some things you leave alone. His route was 71 miles and 138 boxes. He knew them in order. He could tell you, at any point along the way, what was in the next mailbox before he opened it and what would be waiting to go out. He was, in this small and unremarkable way, a kind of expert, and expertise, however small, gives a man a place in the world. Ellis Carver had a place in the world. It was a green pickup on a narrow road in an eastern Kentucky holler 6 mornings a week, before the ridge was fully lit, before most of his neighbors were fully awake, moving mail from box to box. That was his place. He was in no hurry to leave it. That is the shape of the life it happened inside of, friend, a quiet shape, a small shape, the kind of shape a strangeness can move into and take a long time to fill up. Now, I told you about the 7 pairs on the 3rd morning. Let me tell you about the days between the 3rd morning and the morning the boots vanished, because in the telling, I made it sound like it happened all in a rush, and it did not. On the 4th morning, there were 9 pair. On the 5th, 12. On the 6th, back down to 4, which frightened Ellis more than the 12 had, because it meant the count was not simply climbing. It was answering to something. It was doing what it was told. He started keeping notes. He was, as I said, a practical man. When faced with a thing he did not understand, he did what he had been taught to do by 21 years of postal work, which is to say, he kept a log. He bought a small spiral notebook at the drugstore in town, and he wrote in it every morning: date, number of pair, position of pair, weather, what he'd eaten the night before, what he'd dreamed if he could remember. He did not know what he was looking for. He hoped, in the way a man hopes when he has nothing but hope, that the numbers would show him a pattern. They did not show him a pattern. Or if they did, it was not a pattern he could read. He tried. One night, sleeping in the front room, he dragged a mattress down the stairs and set it in front of the door and lay awake on it, with the shotgun beside him and a flashlight in his hand. He did not turn the flashlight on. He listened. The house was quiet. The rain came and went. Nothing happened. He did not sleep, but nothing happened. In the morning, when the first gray light came through the front window, he sat up on the mattress, and he looked around the room, and he saw that his boots, the pair he had been wearing the day before, the only pair in the house that he was sure of, were gone from beside the mattress where he had left them. He got up. He went into the kitchen. His boots were sitting neatly by the back door, which was locked and which he had not touched. He did not sleep in the front room again. He tried, another night, boarding up the front door. He nailed 2 2x4s across it, one high and one low, and he checked the boards 3 times before he went to bed. He slept upstairs. He slept badly. When he came down in the morning, the boards were still nailed to the frame. The door was still shut. There were 4 pairs of boots on the front porch, outside the door, arranged in a neat semicircle facing him, looking at him, if boots can look, through the little pane of glass at the top of the door. He unnailed the boards that day. He did not board the door again. He began, in a way that I do not think he entirely admitted to himself at the time, to talk to the boots. He would come down in the morning. He would look at whatever arrangement they had chosen for themselves that night, and he would say out loud to the empty room, "All right then," or "All right, I see you," or once, on a Wednesday, "Well, I hope you slept better than I did." He did not expect an answer. He did not, so far as I can tell from his letter, ever get one. But the talking was a comfort. The talking was a way of saying to the house, and to whatever was in the house, I am here. I am still here. I have not left. And the boots. They were always the same. Every single pair, down to the fence wire scuff. He examined them with the care of a man examining a suspect. He turned them over. He pulled the laces out and retied them. He put a small mark one morning in the tongue of one pair with the tip of his pocket knife, a tiny nick, so small a stranger would never have seen it. That night he watched to see if the marked pair would come back. It did not. It was gone by evening. He never saw it again. The second man, the one on the road, was another problem entirely. Ellis saw him first at a distance, and each time he saw him, the distance was a little less. On the second sighting, the figure was maybe 200 yards off. On the third, 150. On the fourth, coming around a bend on the west side of the ridge, no more than 70 feet away, walking on the shoulder in the same direction as the pickup. In the same gray coat, with the same satchel, Ellis slowed the pickup. He kept pace with the figure. He rolled the window down. He said, "Hey." The figure did not turn its head. It kept walking at the pace of a slow walk, and the pickup, moving at 10 miles an hour, kept pace with it easily. Ellis could see, from that distance, the back of the man's neck. He could see a small mole there, just below the collar. He knew that mole. It was his own mole. It was in the exact place he had, all his life, felt the collar of every shirt he had ever worn rub against. Before the collar softened up, he said, "Hey, look at me." The figure did not look at him. He said, "Damn it, look at me." The figure kept walking. The road curved. The pickup had to slow to make the curve. When Ellis came out of the curve, the figure was gone. He did not stop the pickup that day. He drove on. He finished the route. He went home. He did not eat supper. The widow Halloway called him on the party line that evening. This is a small detail, but it stuck with him, and he told me about it in the letter. She said, "Ellis, I saw you walking past the house today around 4. I waved. You didn't wave back. "Are you feeling all right?" He said, "Ms. Halloway, I finished the route at 3:30. I was home by 4. There was a pause on the line. And then she said, "Well, honey, then who was that in your coat?" He said he didn't know. He said he'd have to ask around. She said, "Well, whoever it was, I'd tell them to stay off my walk." He tracked Mud right up onto the porch. He said he would tell him. He got off the phone. He went to the front window. He looked at the porch. There were no muddy footprints on his porch. His own porch was clean. He went to the front door. He opened it. He looked at the boots by the door. He said out loud to the boots, "Was that you?" He said, "Was one of you out there today?" None of them answered. But he had the strong and unshakable feeling, standing there in his doorway with the cold coming in around him, that one of the pairs by the door was warmer than the others. Not much, just slightly, as though it had been walking that afternoon on a cold day up onto the widow Halloway's porch and back home, and had only just come inside. He shut the door. He hung up his coat. He sat by the stove. He did not check which pair was warm. He did not, he wrote to me, want to know. Now, as the winter deepened and the strangeness became a routine of its own, Ellis began to notice a smaller thing that troubled him more than the boots and more than the second man on the road. He began to notice that he was forgetting, not big things, not his name or his route or the faces of his neighbors, small things, the shape of his own mother's hands, He had, as a boy, spent whole hours watching his mother roll biscuit dough, and he had known those hands the way you know the pattern of a wallpaper you grew up looking at. And one evening, sitting by the stove, he tried to picture them, and he could not. He could picture the biscuit board. He could picture the flour. He could picture the shape her arms made against the light from the kitchen window. But the hands themselves, when he tried to see them, were pale and empty and blank, like a photograph left too long in the sun. He forgot, one Sunday, the smell of his wife's Sunday roast. He had made a habit, on Sundays after she had died, Wendell Hark, of remembering it, of standing in his empty kitchen and calling up in his mind the exact smell of the beef and the onions and the little bit of thyme she'd always added over his mild objections. It was a small ritual, a small keeping, and on this Sunday, standing in his kitchen, he could not summon the smell. He could summon the word thyme. He could summon the word onion. He could not smell them. He stood there a long time, trying. Eventually he opened the oven, though there was nothing in it, and he stood in front of the empty oven and he cried, softly, for a minute, and then he wiped his face and made himself a cheese sandwich and went to bed. He forgot other things. The name of the road his grandfather had died on, the first line of the hymn his wife had liked best, the face of a boy he had gone to school with and been fond of and lost track of after the war. The forgetting was not a rush. It was not a sudden thing. It was slow, and it was patient, and it took only what a man would not miss immediately. And by the time he did miss it, the thing was already gone. He wrote in his log about the forgetting. He wrote, on a Tuesday in January, cannot remember mother's hands. He wrote, on a Thursday, cannot remember Sunday smell. He wrote, on a Sunday, cannot remember Charlie Whitaker's face. He filled a whole page like this. He looked at the page, he tore it out and burned it in the stove. Not because he did not want the record, because he did not want the record where anything else could see it. He was, by then, sleeping perhaps 3 hours a night. His hands had a small tremor. His eyes were red at the edges. Doreen at the sorting office had begun to look at him with a kind of soft alarm. When he came in of a morning, and she had on 2 occasions offered him coffee from her own pot, which was a thing she had never in 21 years done for anybody. Ellis said thank you and took the coffee and drank it standing up at her counter and went out to his truck and threw up in the parking lot. He was not well. But the boots, always the boots. Every morning. He did not stop coming down the stairs and looking at them. He did not stop counting. He did not stop writing in his log. The log was full of numbers now, dates and counts, and if you had shown it to a man who did not know what it was, he might have thought it was an accounting book or a record of egg production on a small farm. It was neither. It was a record of pair upon pair of boots that were his and were not always his, that came and went in the night, that made his front room, on some mornings, look like the receiving hall of a boarding house full of men who all wore the same shoe. The morning it ended, as I told you, there was nothing in the front room at all, not a boot, not a mark, and Ellis, who by then had reached that state of exhaustion where a man will believe almost anything just to be allowed to stop, allowed himself to hope, and he went to the front door, and he opened it, and he saw the tracks on the porch, his own tracks, coming up, not going. You know the rest, more or less. But there is one more piece I want to tell you, because it is the piece that Ellis wrote at the end of his last letter to me, and it is the piece I have thought about most. He wrote at the very end of that letter that he had, one morning in early March, gone up to the attic of the cabin to look for a box of his wife's things. He had not been in the attic in years. He had not wanted to, but he had a notion that day that he wanted to find a particular photograph of her, one taken on their honeymoon at the coast, in which she was laughing at something he could no longer remember saying, and he wanted to look at that photograph again and try to remember what he had said. The attic was low and dusty and had one small window at the gable end. He crawled through it on his hands and knees. He found the box. He opened it. The photograph was on top. He held it up to the little window. The woman in the photograph was laughing. It was a good photograph. It was his wife, but he did not know her. He looked at her face. He looked at the shape of her mouth, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the little scar under her chin from a fall she had taken as a girl. He looked, and he looked, and he tried to make himself feel the thing a widower feels when he looks at such a photograph, and he felt nothing. She was a stranger. She was a very pretty stranger, standing on a beach in the year 1948, laughing at something Ellis Carver had said. And Ellis Carver, sitting in his attic in March of 1973, could not remember loving her. He put the photograph back in the box. He closed the box. He went downstairs. He went to work. He wrote to me the next week. That was the last letter. I want to believe, friend, that somewhere in that man was still the Ellis I had once known through his letters. I want to believe that the second man, whatever the second man was, did not take everything. That there was some small last bit of Ellis Carver left, sitting behind the eyes, watching a stranger drive his truck and eat his supper and sleep in his bed, watching and waiting and remembering, in whatever way the trapped part of a man remembers, the smell of a Sunday roast and the shape of his mother's hands. But I do not know, and I have thought about it on nights like this one more than I would like to admit. Come closer to the fire, friend. Pull the blanket up. There are more stories yet. Story 2. A woman told me this in Charleston when I was still working the mail route, and she told it to me the way people tell you a thing they've carried a long time and are finally ready to let go of. Her name was Alma Whitfield, and her father had been a ferry operator on a stretch of the northern lakes back in the years just after the Korean War, up where the water is cold in July and colder in January, and the towns along the shore are the kind of towns that empty out in October and don't fill again until Memorial Day. Now listen close. This is how it happened, best as she could tell it, and best as I can pass it along. Her father's name was Harlan Whitfield, and Harlan ran the little pole ferry that crossed a narrow inlet between two peninsulas, hauling summer people over to a scatter of cottages on the far side, and hauling groceries and mail and the odd doctor over in the off-season. It wasn't much of a boat. A flat wooden platform, a hand-crank cable, a small pilot house the size of an outhouse where Harlan sat and smoked his pipe and read paperback westerns when the fog came in. The ferry ran from a small dock at the end of a long wooden staircase that went down the bluff from the road above. From the road to the dock, it was 42 steps. Alma knew this because she had counted them as a small girl every time she went down to bring her father his lunch. And every time she had climbed them again, and every time she had heard her father, at the supper table on winter evenings, Say the words, 42 steps to the water, 42 steps back home. 42 steps a man can count with his eyes shut. It was a saying of his. It became a kind of joke in the family. It became, later, something else. Harlan was a quiet man, big shoulders, a slow way of speaking. He had come home from Korea with a limp that he never explained and a habit of long silences at the kitchen table. Alma's mother had been a small, bright woman, a school teacher, and she had run the house and raised the child and made sure her husband ate and slept and did not drift too far into his silences. When she died, in the winter of 1954, of a pneumonia that came on fast and did not let go, Harlan Whitfield became, in Alma's words, a man made mostly of pauses. Alma was 14 that winter. She kept house for her father. She did the shopping. She cooked what her mother had taught her to cook. She rode the school bus into town on weekdays, and she went down the 42 steps on Saturdays to bring her father his lunch on the ferry. She had grown up on that staircase. She knew every warped board of it. She knew which step creaked, and which step gave a little under a heavy foot, and which step, the 17th from the top, had a rusted nail head that would catch the sole of a shoe if you weren't careful. The first sign that something was wrong came in April of 1955, and it came, as these things often do, not as a shout, but as a whisper. Harlan came up from the ferry one evening, sat down at the supper table, and said quietly, 43 today. Alma looked up from her plate. She said, 43 what, Papa? And he said, steps. 43 steps, counted them twice. She smiled at him. She said, Papa, you must have miscounted. And he looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup, and he said, no, girl, I did not miscount. She thought no more of it. Old men counted wrong sometimes. Grieving men counted wrong more often. She washed the dishes. He read his paperback. The lake wind hummed at the eaves of the little house on the bluff. 2 weeks later, at supper, he said it again. 44 today. She set her fork down. She said, Papa. And he said, I know how it sounds, but there were 44. I have been counting those steps for 16 years. I know how many steps there are. Today there were 44. That night, Alma went down the staircase herself, in the last of the daylight, and she counted. 42. She counted going back up. 42. She stood at the top with her hand on the railing, and she looked down at the dock in the failing light, and she thought, my father is losing his mind. My father is going the way my grandfather went. And she went inside, and she did not sleep well. The count kept climbing, slowly. Not every day, not even every week. But every so often, at supper, her father would say a number, 45, 46, and by the end of that summer, 49. He said them each time in the same flat, considered way, as a man reports the weather. He was not agitated. He was not frightened. He was reporting a fact, the way he might report that the water was choppy or the fog had come in early. 49 steps today, Alma. 49. She did not argue anymore. She did not go down to check anymore. She had checked in secret half a dozen times, at all hours, in all weather, and every time the answer had been the same, 42. She began to believe that fall that whatever was happening to her father was happening only to him, that the extra steps existed only for him, that his staircase, on the days he counted them, was not the same staircase as hers. And then came the morning in November when he did not come home for lunch. Harlan Whitfield always came home for lunch. Rain or snow or high wind, he climbed the 42 steps at 11:45 sharp, ate the meal Alma had left on the stove, drank a cup of coffee, and went back down at 12:30. The ferry did not run at lunchtime. He was, he liked to say, the only man in 100 miles who took his midday meal on a schedule you could set a watch by. That morning in November, Alma had left him a bowl of stew on the stove. She had gone to school. She had come home at 3:30 in the afternoon and found the stew untouched, still on the stove, cold. Her father's coat was not on its hook. His pipe was not in its dish. His paperback Western, with the marker in it at page 111, was not on the arm of his chair. She went down the staircase. She counted. 42. The ferry was tied up at the dock. The pilot house was empty. His pipe was on the little shelf inside, the ash cold. His paperback was on the bench, open, face down, at page 112. He had made a page's progress since he'd left the house that morning. He had not eaten his lunch, and he was not there. The sheriff came. The sheriff searched the shore for 2 days. The county brought a diver up from downstate, and the diver went into the cold water off the dock and found nothing. Harlan Whitfield had, by every appearance, walked down the 42 steps that morning to work the ferry, read a page of his paperback, set the pipe down, and disappeared. Alma was sent to live with an aunt in a town 200 miles south. The little house on the bluff was closed up. The ferry was pulled out of the water for the winter, and in the spring a new operator was found, a younger man from over near the state line, and the ferry ran, and the summer people came, and life on the inlet went on the way life on inlets goes on. Alma grew up. She married. She had children of her own. And 41 years after her father disappeared, in the autumn of 1996, she went back. She was in her 50s then. She had a good husband and grown children and enough money that she did not need to work. Her aunt had left her the deed to the house on the bluff, unopened, unvisited, all those decades, and Alma decided that fall that she wanted to see it once, in daylight, before she sold it. She wanted to walk through the rooms. She wanted to touch the doorframe where her mother had marked her height every birthday. She wanted, though she did not say this out loud, even to herself, to count the steps. She drove up alone. She stayed in a small motel in the nearest town. She had the keys in her purse. The house was small and grayer than she remembered. The wind still hummed at the eaves. The bluff was still the bluff, though the trees along it had grown taller and darker and closer to the roof. She let herself in. The furniture was still there, under white sheets. Her father's paperback westerns were still on the shelf, brittle. Now, the paper yellowed at the edges. There was a smell of mice and lake water and something else, something older, that she could not put a name to. She stood in the front room a long time. She was not, by then, a woman easily frightened. She had raised 3 children through their teenage years. She had buried both of her parents and 1 brother. Fear, in her, had been beaten down by ordinary living into something small and manageable. She walked out to the top of the staircase. The stairs were still there. The railing was rust-eaten, but standing. She could see, 42 steps below, the little dock and the black cold water of the inlet and the wooden platform of the ferry that some later operator had left to rot in the shallows. She started down. She counted. She counted 42. She reached the dock. She turned around and looked up. The staircase, from below, seemed longer than she remembered. She started back up. She counted. She counted 43. She stopped on the top step. Her hand was on the railing. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. She turned around and went back down. 42. Back up. 44. The down again. 42. Up again, and slower this time, and counting out loud, and holding the railing with both hands. 46. She sat down at the top of the stairs. She did not go back into the house. She sat there in the low autumn light, and she looked at the staircase. And she began, at last, to understand what her father had been trying to tell her at all those suppers so long ago. The staircase, she wrote later in a small notebook she kept, was not always the same staircase. The staircase, when it wanted to, added steps to itself. It added them, she believed, on the way up. It added them slow. It added them, perhaps, one at a time. And her father, over months and years, had watched the number grow and had said the number aloud at supper because he had needed someone to know. She did not go down again that day. She locked the house. She drove back to the motel, and she sat up all night with a lamp on, and she wrote in her notebook. The next morning she went back. She had made a decision. She wanted to know how many steps it would go to. She wanted, more than anything, to understand what had happened to her father. She went down. 42, she went up. 51, she went down. 42, she went up. 63, she went down again, and she stood at the bottom, and she looked up, and she saw, at the top of the staircase, in the exact spot where she had been standing an hour earlier, a figure. It was a man. He was standing at the rail. He was looking down at her. She could not make out his face at that distance in the shadow of the eaves. But she could see the shape of his shoulders, and she could see the shape of his coat, and she knew, the way you know your own child in a crowd, that it was her father. He raised one hand. He held it up. He did not wave. He simply held it up. She started up the stairs. She counted. She did not want to. She could not help it. 72, 98, 130. She was climbing now for what felt like an hour, though when she looked at her watch it had been only 20 minutes. The staircase stretched on above her, longer than the bluff itself, longer than the sky above the bluff, longer than any staircase had any business being. The figure at the top waited, did not move, did not lower his hand. At 211 steps, she stopped. She did not know why. She simply stopped, and she looked up, and she saw quite clearly now that the figure at the top of the stairs was not her father. It looked like her father. It had his shoulders, his coat, his hat. But there was something in the way it stood, something in the way it kept its hand up. It was too still. It was standing with the particular stillness of a thing that has never had a body and is trying to remember how a body is supposed to hold itself. It was, Alma wrote in her notebook that night, doing an impression of her father, and the impression was very good, and it was not quite good enough. She turned around. She started back down. She did not look up again. She counted out of some old training of the mind that would not let her stop. 42 on the way down, always 42. Whatever the staircase did on the way up, on the way down it was always what it should be. That was the trick of it, she thought. That was how it kept you. She reached the bottom. She got in her rented boat, Wendell Hark, which she had thought to arrange the day before, and she pushed off from the dock, and she rowed across the inlet to the far side. She left the rented boat at the far dock, and she walked 3 miles down a road to a filling station, and she called a taxi. She never went back to the house. She sold it, sight unseen from a distance, to a developer who tore it down the following spring and put up something with a picture window. The bluff staircase, she was told, had been torn out at the same time. Whatever it had been counting, whatever it had been doing to the count, it was, presumably, done doing. But Alma Whitfield told me that afternoon in Charleston that when she dreams, and she dreams of it still, she said 40-some years later, she is climbing the staircase, and she is counting, and the numbers keep going, and at the top of the staircase there is a figure with her father's shoulders holding up one hand. And every year in the dream, she said, she gets a little closer to the top. And every year in the dream, the figure at the top looks a little more like her. And she wonders, sometimes, if her father is still up there, if he ever finished the climb. If there is a version of the staircase in some place she cannot go, where the count only ever goes up, and where a man in a coat and a hat stands at the top, with his hand raised, waiting for his daughter to reach him, she said she hopes not. She said she hopes he got wherever he was going. But she said, and this was the last thing she said to me before she got up from the table, and paid for her coffee and walked out into the Charleston evening, that some nights, when the wind is right, she can hear him counting, very softly, very slow, from somewhere just above the ceiling of her bedroom, as though he is on a staircase she cannot see, still climbing, and the numbers are still going up, 42, 43, 44 seat leaf tight tonight, friend, and if you live in a house with stairs, do me a small kindness. Don't count them, going up. Some things, once you know the number of, you cannot unknow. Let me tell you a little more about that inlet, friend, because the place matters as much as the people in a story like this one. The inlet where Harlan Whitfield ran his ferry was a narrow stretch of cold water, about 350 yards across, tucked between two peninsulas of pine and birch, up where the northern lakes bleed into one another, through a chain of these small crossings that the locals never bothered to name. On the maps, it was Inlet Number 7. To the people who lived along it, it was just the inlet. To Alma Whitfield, for the whole of her childhood, it was the only piece of water in the world that mattered. The house on the bluff was a 2-story clapboard, painted white every 8 years or so, with a green tin roof and a stone chimney that leaned a little to the north from 100 winters of wind. The front of the house faced the lake. The back of the house faced a stand of red pines so thick that the light did not come through them until noon. Alma's bedroom was on the second floor, at the front, with a window that looked out over the bluff and down onto the ferry dock. She slept, from the age of 6 until the age of 14, listening to the water. The water was always doing something. In summer, it slapped against the pilings of the dock. In fall, it hissed against the shore stones. In winter, it went silent, under the ice, and the silence was its own kind of sound. Alma knew the moods of that water the way city children know the moods of their mothers. She could tell you, from the sound of it against the pilings, whether the wind was out of the north or the west. She could tell you, in November, when the first skin of ice would come. She was, in her own quiet way, a child of the inlet as much as she was a child of her parents. Her mother, Martha Whitfield, was the school teacher at a one-room school 2 miles down the shore road. She taught grades 1 through 6, 12 children in a good year, 7 in a lean one, and she was the sort of woman who could hold 12 small minds in her hand for 6 hours a day, and not lose a single one of them. She was small and quick, and she wore her hair up in a knot at the back of her head, and she had a way of laughing that came out of her. Without warning, a laugh that started small and grew large and ended on a small hiccup that made everyone around her laugh too. Alma has told me more than once that her clearest memory of her mother is that laugh, and the way the whole kitchen would fill with it when Martha found something funny in the evening paper. Martha died in February of 1954. She had gone into school with a cold on a Monday, taught through Wednesday with the cold turning into something worse, come home on Wednesday evening shaking, and been in the hospital by Friday and dead by Sunday night. Pneumonia, they said. It happened like that then in the country, in winter. It could still happen like that now, though we like to pretend it can't. After Martha died, the house on the bluff got very quiet. Harlan Whitfield had never been a talker, and without Martha to speak into the silences grew. Alma made supper. Harlan ate it. He said thank you. He read his westerns. She did her homework. The clock in the front room ticked. The wind moved the red pines. Some nights, from her bedroom window, she watched the small light at the end of the ferry dock, and she thought about her father down there in the pilot house, alone with his pipe and his book. And she wondered what he was thinking, and she knew she would never ask. There is a particular loneliness, friend, between a father and a daughter after a mother dies. It is not the loneliness of two people who do not love each other. It is the loneliness of two people who love each other and cannot find the words. It is a loneliness that fills a house the way water fills a boot, slowly, from the bottom up, until one day you look down and there is no dry place left to stand. That is the loneliness Alma Whitfield was living in the spring. Her father first said, at supper, 43 today. She thought, at first, that he was making a joke. He was not a joking man, but grief does strange things to quiet men, and she thought perhaps he was trying, in some clumsy way, to open a door between them. She smiled. She teased him a little. She let it pass. When he said it again, 2 weeks later, she understood that it was not a joke, and she began to be afraid, to fear, in a girl of 14, in a house on a bluff over a cold northern inlet, in a town where the nearest doctor was 11 miles down a bad road, is not the fear of a horror movie. It is a slower fear. It is the fear that says, my father is not right, and if my father is not right, there is nobody to be right for me, and I am 14 and I do not know what to do. That is the fear Alma lived with, all through that spring and summer and fall, while the count at supper climbed. 44, 45, 46. She did not tell anyone. She was too afraid of what would happen if she did. The county could take a father away from a girl in those days on very little evidence, and Alma had heard stories in school of children sent to live with strangers because their remaining parent had been judged unfit. She would rather have lived with the count than lived without her father. She loved him. He was all she had, so she cooked, and she cleaned, and she went down the 42 steps on Saturdays with his lunch, and she counted them every time, and every time she counted 42, and every time she came home, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she looked at her father across it, and she waited to see what number he would say that night. There is a thing I did not tell you yet about the staircase, friend, and it is a small thing, but it stayed with Alma for the rest of her life. On the morning Harlan Whitfield disappeared, when Alma came home from school and found the cold stew on the stove. She did not go down the 42 steps right away. She stood at the top of them for a long time first. It was a cold November afternoon. The sky over the inlet was the color of an old nickel. The wind was moving in the pines behind the house, and she stood at the top of the staircase, and she looked down, and she could not at first make herself go. She told me, more afraid at that moment than she would be at any other moment of her life. More afraid than the day she found the second man watching her from the top of the stairs 41 years later. More afraid than the night her own husband would have his first heart attack 32 years after that. More afraid than the day her youngest child was 5 days late being born. This, she said, this was the deepest afraid I have ever been, because she knew, standing at the top of that staircase in the cold November wind at 14 years old with a book bag still slung over one shoulder, she knew that her father was not coming back up. She did not know how she knew. She had no evidence yet. The stew was cold on the stove. That was all. But she knew, and she stood there, and she did not go, because she was afraid that if she went down and she counted, the number would not be 42 anymore. She was afraid the number, on the way down, would be something else. She was afraid that whatever had been climbing extra steps into her father's count had at last come the other direction. She went down eventually. She counted. It was 42. Every step. She got to the bottom. She stood on the dock. She looked at the empty pilot house. She looked at the paperback, face down, open at page 112. She looked at the cold pipe on the shelf, and she turned around and went back up. On the way up, she did not count. She would not let herself. She kept her eyes on her feet. She kept her eyes, and she went up as fast as she could. And when she reached the top, she was breathing hard, and she went straight inside, and she called the sheriff on the party line, and she did not go back down the staircase again for 41 years. That is the thing I did not tell you, that she did not count on the way up that first day. She always wondered, in the decades after, whether if she had counted, the number would have told her something. She always wondered whether she had, by refusing to count, missed her only chance to understand. She wondered a lot of things in the years after. She wondered whether her father had known that last morning that he was not coming back, whether he had made his peace with it, whether he had climbed those extra steps deliberately, chosen to keep climbing when other men would have turned back, whether there was a version of that morning in some place she could not go, where he had reached the top of whatever staircase he had climbed, and someone had been waiting for him there, and he had gone with them. She hoped so. She hoped, in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not lost a father young, that whatever had taken him had at least taken him somewhere, that he had not simply been unmade. She could bear the thought of him gone. She could not bear the thought of him unmade. The years passed. She grew up in her aunt's house, 200 miles south. She graduated from a small high school. She went to a normal school and got her teaching certificate, the way her mother had done a generation before. She taught grades 3 and 4 in a small town in North Carolina for 31 years. She married a man named Peter Whitfield, who by a small coincidence had the same last name as her own, and she did not have to change her name, which pleased her in some private way she never quite examined. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. She was, by every outward measure, a woman who had recovered, But she never went in a lighthouse. She never took a job in a tall building. She refused all her adult life to climb any staircase where she could not see the top from the bottom. She would take an elevator if there was one. She would take the long way around if there was not. Her children thought this was a small eccentricity. She never explained it to them. She never explained anything about her father to them, in fact. When they asked about their grandfather, she said, "He ran a ferry, and he went missing when I was 14, and we never found out what happened, and I do not like to talk about it." And her children, being kind children, learned not to ask. Only when the last of her children was grown and gone did she begin to think again about going back. And it was almost 20 years after that, in the fall of 1996, before she made herself do it. There is one more piece of the story I want to tell you, friend, and then we will let Alma rest. Shund, hark! When she wrote in her little notebook, on the last night of that trip, she wrote something she did not tell anyone for many years afterward. She wrote about what she had seen at the top of the stairs in the moment before she turned and started down. She wrote that the figure had, indeed, looked like her father, that the shoulders had been his, that the coat had been his, that the hat had been his hat, the same brown felt hat, with the small darker mark on the crown from where he had once set it on a wet railing and forgotten it there for an hour. But she wrote that the hand, the one held up in what she had first taken to be a wave or a signal, had been wrong. The hand had had too many fingers, not many too many. One extra finger between the ring finger and the little finger, held up alongside the others, patient and unmoving. She wrote that she had counted them. She had, from a distance of what must have been 50 feet, counted the fingers on that upheld hand. Because her mind, in the moment, had done a thing that minds sometimes do when they are being asked to accept an impossible thing. Her mind had told her, "This is not a person, count the fingers, and then you will know," and she had counted, and there were 6. She wrote that this was the moment she had turned around and started back down, that it was not the length of the staircase, or the impossible count on the way up, or even her recognition that the figure was not her father. It was the finger, the extra finger, the small, terrible, patient extra finger, held up in the cold light at the top of the bluff, as though the thing above her had spent 41 years practicing its impression of her father and had gotten every part of it right except one, and was showing her that one part now, deliberately, because it wanted her to know. I don't know what to make of it, friend. I've turned it over in my mind many times. I don't know why a thing that could copy a coat and a hat and the exact carriage of a man's shoulders would put 6 fingers on the hand it held up. I don't know if it was a mistake, or if it was a signature, or if it was a message the meaning of which I cannot read. Alma had a theory, though. She told it to me the last time we spoke, a few years before she passed. She said she had come to believe, in her old age, that the extra finger was a mercy, that whatever had climbed that staircase and taken her father had, in showing her the finger, been telling her to go. She said that a thing which wanted only to take her would not have shown her anything wrong at all. It would have played the part of her father exactly, and it would have called down to her, and it would have said in her father's voice, "Come up, girl. I have been waiting." And she would have gone. She would have run up those stairs, however many they turned out to be, and she would have gone into the arms of the thing that had taken her father and she would never have come back down. She was sure of it. She said she could feel, standing at the bottom of the stairs, how badly she had wanted to run up. She said the not running had been the hardest thing she ever did. But the finger, the extra finger, it had broken the spell. It had said to her, wordlessly, "This is not your father. Go home." She believed, in her later years, that some part of what had once been her father was still inside the thing at the top of the stairs, that her father had been trying, in the only way he could, to warn her that the extra finger was his signal to her, made through the thing that wore him. Go home, girl. Don't come up. This is not the place. This is not the man. I hope she was right, friend. I hope her father was still in there somewhere, doing that last small thing for his daughter across 41 years and however many extra steps. But I have wondered, on nights like this one, whether it was really that. Whether the extra finger was not a warning, but a wave. Whether the thing at the top of the stairs was showing her, in its patient, wordless way, that there was room for one more up there, that the count could always add another, that whatever it had made of her father, it could make more of, given time, given a name, given a woman 14 years old at the bottom of a staircase in November who did not count on her way back up. I don't know. I hope I am wrong. Alma Whitfield hoped she was right. We will not know now, friend. Alma sleeps easier than she used to. So, I hope, does her father. So, I hope tonight, do you. Just remember what I said. In a house of stairs, don't count them on the way up. Some numbers are better left unlearned. Story 3, I lived this one myself. Or I think I did. My memory isn't what it was, and there are corners of this story that I've turned over so many times in my mind that the edges have worn soft, and I can no longer say for certain which parts are mine and which parts have crept in from someplace else. But I'll tell it to you the way it sits in me tonight. Take it as you will. Now listen close. This is how I remember it, best as I can. It was 4 winters ago, or maybe 5, when my niece asked me to help her out for a few nights down in southern Louisiana. She was working as a night nurse for a home health outfit out of Baton Rouge, and one of her long-term patients, an old woman named Miss Odile Fontenot, 96 years old, and living alone in a stilted cabin out on the edge of the bayou, had taken a turn for the worse, and the family wanted somebody in the house around the clock until things, one way or another, sorted themselves out. My niece could cover the days. She needed somebody she trusted for the nights. Her husband had a job. Her mother was too far. She called me, and because I loved her, and because I had time, and because a man on the far end of his life doesn't have much better use for a week than to sit with a woman on the far end of hers, I said yes. I drove down on a Tuesday in December. The rain started somewhere south of Memphis and did not let up until I turned off the highway 200 miles later onto a shell and mud road that ran through cypress and Spanish moss for the last 4 miles before it dead-ended at Miss Odile's little raised cabin. The cabin sat on stilts about 8 feet up, with a wooden staircase leading to a covered porch, and a single bare bulb burning above the door. That bulb, friend, is why I'm telling you this story. But I didn't know that yet. My niece met me at the door. She showed me around. The cabin was 2 rooms and a kitchen, a wood stove, a small bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and 1 bedroom at the back, where Miss Odile lay in a hospital bed the family had brought in 3 months earlier. She was small under the sheets. Her hair was thin and white as milkweed silk. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was long and slow, the way the breathing gets at the very end. "My niece," said, the doctor had said any day now. Any day now for 3 weeks, the old woman opened her eyes once while I was standing there. She looked at me. She did not look at my niece. She looked only at me, and she said very softly, in a voice that had almost nothing left of a voice in it, "You are new." And then she closed her eyes again. My niece said, "She does that sometimes. She talks to people who aren't there. It's the medication." I said, "Of course," but I was not sure. I had watched her look at me, and I had watched her not look at my niece, and I did not think it was the medication. I did not say so. My niece left at 8 in the evening. I settled in. The cabin was quiet, the way a cabin over water is quiet. A soft lapping sound came up through the floorboards. The wind moved in the cypress. The rain, which had stopped for a while, started again, a slow, steady patter on the tin roof. I sat in a wicker chair in the front room with a cup of tea and a book, and I listened to Miss Odile breathe in the back room, and I felt for the first time in a long time a kind of peace. There is a particular quiet, friend, that only comes in a house where someone is dying. It is not a sad quiet. It is a waiting quiet. It is the quiet of a room where something important is about to happen, and everybody in the room, including the walls, knows it and is holding still. Around 10 o'clock, the bulb over the front door went out. I saw it through the little window in the front room. 1 second it was on. The next second it wasn't. I got up, went to the door, opened it, and looked up at the fixture. The bulb was still in its socket. It was cool to the touch. I found a spare in a drawer by the stove, and I climbed on a chair, and I put the new bulb in. Nothing happened. The bulb did not come on. I checked the switch inside the door. It was in the on position. I flipped it off, flipped it on. Nothing. I got down. I sat back in my chair. I told myself the bulb was fine, the fixture was old, the wiring in a stilt cabin in the bayou was probably held together with prayer and electrical tape, and this was not a problem for tonight. But the porch, without the bulb, was dark, and the dark on that porch was not the dark of a suburban street with a street lamp 2 houses down. It was a real dark, the kind of dark that lets you know there are miles and miles of nothing between you and the next light. Around 11, I heard the footsteps on the stairs. They came up slow. One board, then the next, a slow, considered climb, like a man taking his time, like a man carrying something he did not want to drop. I sat very still. I set the book down. I listened. 9 steps. The staircase up to that porch had 9 steps. I had counted them coming in, out of a habit I have from a story I once heard from a woman named Alma. 9 steps up, 9 steps to the porch. The footsteps went to 8, and then they stopped. I waited. I did not breathe. The rain went on. The lapping under the floor went on. The wind in the cypress went on. And on the 8th step, whatever it was that had climbed up out of the dark simply stood, and did not come the last step, and did not go back down. After what felt like a long time, I got up. I walked to the door. I did not open it. I put my ear against it. I could hear, faintly, on the other side of it, breathing, not on the porch, on the stairs, 1 step down, waiting. I stepped back. I checked the lock. It was locked. I went to the back of the cabin. I checked the back door. It was locked. I went to Miss Odile's room. She was breathing the same slow way. Her eyes were closed. The little lamp on her nightstand was on. Everything was as I had left it. I stood in the doorway for a moment, and I watched her, and I felt, again, that peculiar peace of a house where something is waiting. I went back to the front room. I sat in my chair. I did not open the door. I did not go out on the porch, and after another 20 minutes or so, I heard the footsteps go back down the stairs. Slowly, just as they had come up, at the bottom they stopped. And then, from what must have been the shell path below, I heard a voice. Not loud, not quite loud enough to make out the words, but close enough to know it was a voice. It said something. It said it once. And then whatever it was that had come up the path went back the way it had come, and the night settled again into its long, wet quiet. I sat up until dawn. I did not sleep. In the morning, my niece came. She brought coffee and pastries from a little place in the nearest town. I did not tell her about the footsteps. I told her the bulb over the front door had gone out. I asked her if there was a story about it. She looked at me a little too long. Then she said, "Oh, that bulb. Miss Odile won't let me change it. It's been out for weeks. She says it went out the night her husband died in 1979, and she doesn't want it lit again." I said, "Well, I put a new one in." My niece looked at me. She said, "You did what?" I said, "I put a new bulb in last night when the old one went out. But it didn't come on." She said, "Very slowly, Uncle, the bulb didn't go out last night. It's been out for weeks." I said, "No, it went out around 10. I saw it." She said, "It's been out for weeks. There's no bulb in the fixture. There hasn't been a bulb in the fixture since I started coming out here. She unscrewed it years ago." I got up. I went to the door. I opened it. I stepped out on the porch, and I looked up. The fixture was empty. The socket was bare. There was no bulb in it, new or old, I told myself. Standing there in the pale, wet morning, that I had dreamed the whole thing. The bulb going out, the trip to the drawer, the chair, the new bulb, all of it. I told myself I had fallen asleep in the wicker chair, and I had dreamed a bulb, and I had dreamed a set of footsteps on the stairs. And this was, if not exactly a comfort, at least a manageable thing to believe. I told myself that for the next 2 nights. I told myself that while I sat in the wicker chair and did not read my book and did not sleep and listened, every night around 11, to the footsteps come up the stairs and stop on the 8th step and stand and breathe, and after 20 minutes go back down. I told myself that when the voice at the bottom of the stairs got a little clearer each night, and I understood on the 2nd night that it was saying a name I did not know, a name I did not want to know. On the 3rd night, Miss Odile opened her eyes. It was a little after 10. The rain was heavy. I was sitting by her bed at that moment because I had taken to sitting with her at night on the theory that whatever peace was in this cabin was more concentrated in her room than in mine, and I wanted to be in it. She looked at me. Her eyes were very clear. She said, "You hear him too?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you know his name?" I said, "No." She said, "That's good. Don't ask. Don't answer when he says one." I said, "Whose name is he saying?" She said, "Mine. He's been saying mine for 42 years, every night. Since my husband made the trade, I did not ask what the trade was. She told me anyway." She spoke very softly and very slowly, and her voice was thin as a thread, but it did not break. She said her husband had been a fisherman. She said he had gone out one October in a small boat, and he had been caught in a storm, and he should have died out there, and he had not died out there. He had come home in the morning, wet and shaking, and he had sat at their kitchen table, and he had told her over a cup of coffee that he could not hold without spilling, that a man had come up beside his boat in the storm, a man walking on the water, a man who had said to him, "I will let you go home tonight, but someone will owe me a life for it, not yours. Whoever's name is called at your door will be mine." Her husband had come home. Her husband had thought, in his terror and gratitude, that no one would come to the door in the night to call a name. Her husband had been wrong. On the third night after he came home, the footsteps had come up the porch stairs and had stopped on the 8th step, and a voice had called his name, and her husband had opened the door before she could stop him, and he had stepped out onto the porch, and the porch light had gone out, and when she went to the door herself, the porch had been empty. She had unscrewed the bulb the next morning. She had never put a new one in, and every night for 42 years, she said, he had come back up the stairs. Every night he had stopped on the 8th step. Every night he had said her name, and every night she had not answered, and had not gone to the door, and had not turned on any light. She said, "He'll come tonight. He'll say my name. Don't answer for me. Don't turn on any light. If you turn on a light on that porch, he'll think somebody is answering." I said, "I don't understand." She said, "That's the trade. The light is the answer. My husband turned it on when he heard his name. That's what let him out." She closed her eyes. She was so tired. She said, "One more night, maybe 2. Then it won't matter. Then he can have me. Just don't let him have anybody else." She did not open her eyes again that night. I went and sat in the wicker chair in the front room. The rain came down harder. At 11:10, the footsteps came up the stairs. They stopped on the 8th step. The voice from the porch, very clear now, very close, said Miss Odille's name. I did not move. I did not answer. I did not touch the light switch. The voice said her name a second time. It was patient. It was almost kind. I did not answer. The voice said her name a third time, and then, very softly, it said mine. Friend, I have not told anybody this part of the story before tonight. It said mine, not shouted, not demanded, just said it, as though it were reading a list, and my name was on the list, and it wanted me to know it was there. I did not move. I did not answer. I did not turn on the light. I sat in that wicker chair with my hands folded in my lap, and I listened to my own heart, and I waited. After a long time, the footsteps went back down the stairs. The voice at the bottom said something I could not quite hear. Then the rain closed over the sound of it, and the cabin was quiet again, and I sat there in the dark until the light came up gray over the cypress. Miss Odille died the next afternoon, peaceful, holding my niece's hand. The bulb was still out. It has been out, my niece tells me, ever since. The family sold the cabin. The new people, apparently, put a new bulb in the fixture the day they moved in. The new people, I understand, did not stay long. I came home. I drove north through the same rain I had driven south through. I sat in this chair by this fire, and I have sat here many nights since. But I'll tell you a thing, friend, and then I'll tell no more of this one. Every so often, in the small hours, when the rain is on the roof the way it is on the roof tonight, I hear footsteps come up my porch. They come up slow. They stop, always, one step short of the top, and a voice on the other side of the door says my name. Just once, just quiet, just once. I do not answer. I do not turn on any porch light. I sit in this chair, and I wait, and after a while, the footsteps go back down. But he knows the name now, and I think, though I hope I am wrong, that he is a patient sort, and that he will come back. and he will keep coming back. Until one night, in a moment of forgetting, in a moment of ordinary human weakness, I get up in the dark to see who has come to my door. I try not to forget, friend. I try very hard, but a man gets tired. A man forgets things. So if you're listening to this in a house of your own tonight, and the rain is coming down, and the porch light is on, do me one small kindness. Turn it off before you sleep. Just in case. Just in case. Let me tell you a little more about that drive down, friend, because I've been thinking about it lately, and there was a small thing along the way that I did not understand at the time, and now, some years later, I wonder if it was part of the same thing. I left home on that Tuesday morning at about 6 a.m. It was still dark when I pulled out of the driveway, and the truck was cold, and the heater took a good 10 minutes to work up to anything you'd call warmth. I had a thermos of coffee. I had a paper bag with 2 egg sandwiches my sister had made me the night before. I had a small overnight case with a change of clothes for a week, and a folder of the paperwork my niece had sent me. Some notes on Miss Odille's medications, a diagram of the cabin, the number of the family's oldest son who lived up in Shreveport, and a photocopied map with the Shell and Mud Road, marked in yellow highlighter. The drive from my place down to that inlet is about 900 miles, and I took it slow. I stopped for gas twice, once for lunch, once to walk around a small town square in Mississippi where a woman was selling pralines out of a folding chair on the sidewalk. I bought 3. I ate one right there. The other 2 I set on the passenger seat. And by the time I reached the bayou, they had gone soft in the heat and stuck to the wax paper. And I ate them anyway, standing in a filling station parking lot at the last exit before the highway ended, somewhere on the second half of the drive, in a stretch of Louisiana where the highway ran straight for 40 miles between fields of sugarcane. I passed a truck going the other way. It was a green truck, an older model. It had a small dent in the tailgate. I did not think anything of it at the time, but I looked in the rearview mirror as it passed, and I saw the driver, and the driver was an old man, and the old man was looking back at me in his own rearview mirror, and for a moment our eyes met across the highway. He looked like me, friend. I did not think about it much then. I thought, that fellow could be my brother. And I drove on, and I forgot about it for years. I remembered it later. I remembered it after the week at Miss Odille's. I remembered it in the middle of the night, in my own bed, with the rain on the roof. I remembered it, and I sat up and I thought about a story I had heard years before from a postal carrier in eastern Kentucky, and I thought, no, that's not the same thing. That's not what that was. I still think it's not the same thing. Most nights I still think that, but I have wondered, friend. I have wondered. Anyway, I got to the cabin at about 4 in the afternoon. The rain had let up. The sky over the bayou was the color of pewter, and the cypress were dark against it, and the Spanish moss hung down in long gray beards, and the water below the stilted cabin was black and still, and had a faint smell of iron. I sat in the truck a moment before I got out. I looked up at the cabin. I looked at the single bulb over the door. The bulb, I want to note, was not lit. It was gray. It was the color of a dead moth. I remember thinking, well, that must be on a switch inside. I did not think at that moment that the fixture was empty. I thought it was just off. That was a small mistake, and I would not understand it was a mistake until 3 nights later. I got out. I went up the 9 wooden steps, and I noted each one, and I knew from an old habit that there were 9 and I filed the number away in the small back room of my mind where I keep such things. My niece met me at the door, and you know most of the rest. Let me back up and tell you a bit more about Miss Odile herself, because in the telling I made her sound like just an old woman in a bed, and she was more than that. She had been, in her long life, a great deal more than that, and I feel I owe it to her to say so. Odile Fontenot had been born in that same cabin in the winter of 1928, in a bed her father had built out of cypress with his own hands. She had, my niece told me one afternoon over coffee at the little kitchen table, delivered babies as a midwife in that part of the parish for the better part of 40 years. She had, in her middle age, taken in 3 foster children when their mother went to prison and their father drank himself to death, and raised them alongside her own 2, and given them her last name, and put all 5 of them through the little parish school and 2 of them through college. She had, in her 70s, still gone out in a flat-bottomed boat with a cane pole and caught more catfish in an hour than most grown men caught in a day. She was, in short, the sort of woman whose life would fill a whole book if anybody had thought to write it down, and nobody had, and now the book was almost closed, and only my niece and I were sitting at its bedside on that last week, watching the pages turn. She spoke to me a few more times over those days. Not often, not for long, but she spoke and I listened. On the second afternoon, she opened her eyes and she said to me, "Do you have children?" I said, "No, ma'am. My wife and I were never blessed." She said, "That's all right. Children are a joy and a knife. Some of us are meant to hold the knife, some of us are meant not to." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "My husband and I never had one of our own either. The 5 that were ours weren't ours by blood, but they were ours all the same." I said, "That's a fine thing." She said, "It was." She closed her eyes. She was quiet a long time. I thought she had gone back to sleep. Then, without opening her eyes, she said, "My husband made a trade. Did they tell you?" I said, "No, ma'am." She said, "My niece won't tell you. She thinks it's just the medication talking. It's not." I said, "All right." She said, "He made a trade. He came home when he shouldn't have, and a debt has been coming to the door every night since. My name has been on that debt. I have not answered, but the debt does not go away because you don't answer it. The debt waits. The debt is patient." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "If you sit up nights with me, you'll hear him, I'm sorry to say it. I would spare you if I could." I said, "That's all right." She said, "You're a kind man. But listen to me. When you hear him, don't answer. Don't turn on any light. And whatever else you do, don't ever tell him your name. Not by accident. Not in your sleep. Not even in a dream. Do you understand me?" I said, "I understand you." She said, "Good." She said it very quietly. Then she said, "Thank you for coming down. My niece is a good girl, but she is young. She is not old enough yet to sit up with a dying woman all alone through the night. You are old enough. That is what I needed." She was asleep after that, or something close to it. I sat with her a while longer. The rain started up again on the tin roof. The bayou lapped under the floor, and I thought, sitting there, about the trade she had spoken of, and the debt and the name at the door, and I thought about the bulb over the porch, and I thought I was beginning, in a small and terrible way, to understand what I was in. Then I got up and went to the front room, and I sat in the wicker chair, and I waited for 11 o'clock on the 3rd night, when Miss Odile told me the whole story, and when the voice on the porch said my name. I did not tell you everything about that either. Let me tell you now. When the voice said my name, it said it in my own voice. That is a thing I did not put in before, because it is the part I like least. The voice on the porch, the one that had for 3 nights been calling Miss Odille's name in a stranger's tones. That voice, on the 3rd night, at the moment of speaking my name, was not a stranger's voice. It was my own voice exactly. As if someone had recorded me on a tape long ago, some afternoon I could not remember, and had cut a single word from that tape, my name, and was playing it back to me now. Through the door, in the rain, I have thought about that a great deal in the years since. I do not have a good explanation for it. Miss Odile said her husband's voice on the porch on the 3rd night after the storm had been his own. She said he had told her that afterward. She said that was how the thing at the door worked. On the first 2 nights, it learned. On the 3rd night, it was ready. I did not turn on the light. I did not answer. I have already told you that, but I want you to know that I understood. Sitting in that wicker chair, with my own voice, speaking my own name through the door, exactly how a man could have opened it. Exactly how Miss Odile's husband, 42 years earlier, had stood up out of his own chair and walked to his own door and reached for the switch. It was not fear that made him do it. It was recognition. It was the strange comfort of hearing your own voice call you home. It was the deepest trick, friend. The deepest trick of all. I did not answer, but I understood. There is one last piece I want to tell you before I let this one rest. Some 3 years after Miss Odile died, I got a letter in the mail. It was a plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from a small town in southern Louisiana that I did not recognize. The handwriting on the envelope was careful, old-fashioned, done with a fountain pen. I opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Inside was a single sheet of yellow legal paper folded in thirds. On the paper was written in the same careful hand one sentence. The sentence was this: "He has come to my door now." There was no signature. There was no name. There was nothing else on the page. I sat at the kitchen table a long time with that letter in my hands. I thought about who could have sent it. I thought about the family, the son up in Shreveport, the daughter in New Orleans, the 3 foster children whose married names I did not know. I thought about the neighbors, of whom there were none within a mile of that cabin. I thought about the little parish itself, and whether some priest or postman had known what Miss Odile had been carrying, and had known she had passed it on to me, and had decided, for whatever reason, to let me know that it had passed on again. I did not answer the letter. There was no address to answer to, but I have wondered, on nights like this one, whether the thing at the door has kept walking all these years, from house to house along that bayou and beyond it. Whether it goes wherever its debt is owed and calls whatever name is written on the debt, and waits 3 nights and speaks the name in the man's own voice, and waits to see if the man will answer. And whether, at some house in the last 3 years, some man in a chair by his own door has answered, and whether the letter I received was that man's letter, sent before he answered, as a way of passing the word along. I hope not. I hope the letter was a joke. I hope some cousin of my niece's, hearing an old woman's fever talk once and misremembering it, decided to play a small, mean prank on the man who had sat up with her grandmother. I hope that, but I do not always hope that, friend. Some nights, when the rain is on the roof and the fire is low, and I hear my porch settle in the way old wood settles, I do not hope that at all. I sit in this chair, and I do not turn on the porch light, and I do not answer, and I wait for the sound to go by. It always has gone by. So far, rest easy now, friend. There are more stories yet. There is a whole long night. We have hours together, you and I, and the fire is going to burn a while, and the rain is going to keep on falling, and my voice is going to keep on going. You have no work to do here. You have nothing to remember. You only have to breathe and to listen. That is all any of us ever have to do in the end. Close your eyes. Let the room go soft. Let my voice be a small thing at the edge of the dark. We will be here together a while yet. Story 4. The man who told me this died the following spring. I never learned if that was connected. His name was Wendell Rourke, and he had been a land surveyor for a small county assessor's office out in the flat middle of western Kansas for something close to 30 years by the time we crossed paths. He told me this story on the porch of a boarding house in Wichita in the summer of 1994 over the course of about 3 hours and half a bottle of a cheap Kentucky bourbon he had brought along in a paper sack. Now listen close. This is how he told it, best as I can pass it along. Wendell Rourke had a very particular life. He drove a county pickup, gray, with a magnetic sign on each door that said County Assessor in blocky black letters. He wore a khaki uniform shirt with his name stitched in red thread above the pocket. He carried a clipboard, 100-foot steel tape, a pair of binoculars, a plumb bob on a length of yellow twine, a Polaroid camera with a leather strap, and a small brown notebook in which he kept, in careful print, the measurements of every property he had ever laid eyes on. His job, most days, was simple. He drove out to a piece of land. He walked it. He measured it. He photographed the outbuildings, if there were any. He noted the condition of the fences, the roofs, the wells. He came back to the county office, and he entered his findings in the assessor's book. He was, by every account of the men he worked with, a careful man, a slow man, and a man who could be trusted to give a fair report, even when the landowner was a friend of the sheriff, or the sheriff's cousin, or the sheriff himself. He was 53 years old the year this happened. He was unmarried. He lived alone in a small apartment above a hardware store in the county seat. He read paperback mystery novels in the evening, drank 1 glass of beer with his supper, and went to bed at 10. He had, he told me, been happy in his life in a small and steady way. He had not asked for much, and he had not been given much, and the arrangement had suited him. He owned, of course, a pair of leather work gloves. Every man in that line of work owned a pair. His were a soft yellow deerskin, well broken in, with dark sweat marks at the wrists and small nicks on the palms from 20 years of barbed wire fences. He was fond of them the way a man gets fond of any tool he has used long enough to forget he is using. He kept them, when he was not wearing them, on the dashboard of the pickup, folded together, right glove on top of left. The left glove had a small tear on the inside of the thumb, which he had been meaning to have stitched for 6 years and had never gotten around to. The right glove was whole. I am telling you about the gloves in particular because the gloves are how it started. It was a Tuesday in October. The sky over western Kansas was that particular pale blue you only get on a dry autumn day out on the plains, the kind of blue that makes a man look up at it and feel small in a way that is not entirely unpleasant. Wendell drove out to a piece of land about 18 miles west of town. The land belonged to an estate whose owner had died the year before and whose heirs were in Denver and had not seen the place. There was a small farmhouse, boarded up, and a barn that had partly collapsed, and a windmill that still turned in the wind, and about 160 acres of dry prairie, with a shallow creek cut through the middle of it. He parked the pickup at the end of a dirt track. He got out. He reached for the gloves on the dashboard. There was only one glove. The right glove was there. The left was gone. He looked around the cab. He looked on the floorboards. He looked under the seat. He shook out the folder of paperwork on the passenger seat. He got back out and looked in the bed of the truck. The left glove was not in any of these places. He told me, a moment then of the particular annoyance a careful man feels when a careful thing has gone wrong. He knew he had put the gloves on the dashboard the night before, when he came in from measuring a small tract north of town. He knew he had not touched them since. He was certain of it. His keys had been in his pocket. His hat had been on the seat. The gloves had been on the dashboard, folded, right on top of left, the way he always folded them. He decided he had, perhaps, dropped the left one on his way in the night before. He would look for it when he got back. In the meantime, he had 160 acres to walk. He put on the right glove, tucked his bare left hand in his coat pocket when he wasn't using it, and got on with his work. The property took him most of the day. He measured. He photographed. He wrote in his brown notebook. The wind moved in the dry grass. The windmill turned. The sky went from pale blue to deep blue to that soft gold you get in the last hour before sunset on the prairie. He was tired when he got back to the pickup. He was ready for supper. He opened the driver's side door. The right glove was on the dashboard where he had left it. The left glove, folded neatly, was on top of it. He stood in the doorway of the truck for a long moment. He looked at the gloves. He looked out at the empty land around him. There was, in every direction, nothing. No other vehicle, no other person, no animal larger than a pheasant. The nearest house was 3 miles away. He had been the only living thing on that 160 acres for the entire day, and he was as sure of that as a man could be of anything. He picked up the left glove. He turned it over. He looked at the inside of the thumb. The small tear was gone. The leather was whole. The stitching was tight. It looked like a glove that had come out of a box that morning, if a box could produce a glove already broken in by 20 years of wear. He put both gloves in his coat pocket. He drove home. He did not stop for supper. He went up to his apartment, and he sat at his little kitchen table, and he laid the gloves out in front of him. And he looked at them a long time. They were, in every visible way, his gloves. The right glove was the right glove. The left glove was the left glove, only whole. He turned them over. He held them up to the light of the little kitchen bulb. He put his hands into them. They fit. Of course they fit. He took them off. He set them down. He got up and made himself a cheese sandwich, which he ate standing at the counter, and he did not taste it, and he went to bed. Now, Wendell Rourke was not a man given to spiritual thinking, and he was not a man given to imagination. He was a man given to measurement. And so, in the days that followed, he did what a measurer does. He measured. He measured, first, the gloves themselves. He got out his steel tape. He unfolded it on the kitchen table. He measured the length of each glove from cuff to fingertip. Right glove, 12 3/4 of an inch. Left glove, 12 3/4 of an inch. He measured the width across the palm. Right, 4 1/8. Left, 4 1/8. He measured the length of the thumb, the length of each finger, the width of the cuff. Every number matched. Every number was, so far as he could tell, exactly the number it had always been. The only difference between his glove and the new glove was the tear on the thumb, which was to say, the only difference was that the new glove was better. He should have thrown it away. He knew this. Any story like this that a man has read, or heard told at a bar, or seen at the picture show, tells you clearly that the strange thing must be thrown away. But friend, let me tell you a thing about how these stories work in real life. In real life, when the strange thing arrives, and the strange thing is a small, useful improvement upon a thing you already loved, you do not throw it away. You use it, because throwing it away would be admitting that something impossible has happened. And admitting that something impossible has happened is the first step down a road you do not want to walk. Wendell Rourke did not want to walk that road. So he put on the new left glove the next morning, and the right glove that had always been his, and he went to work. That was the first mistake. He told me on the porch that night. The rest of what happened, he said, followed from that first mistake, and he did not blame anybody but himself for any of it. For a week, nothing else happened. The gloves were the gloves. He wore them. He worked. He came home. He read his mystery novel. He slept. On the following Wednesday, the right glove disappeared. He came out to the truck in the morning, and it was gone from the dashboard. The left glove sat where he had left it, folded. Nothing else in the cab had been touched. His keys were where he had left them. His notebook was where he had left it. Only the right glove was gone. He drove out to that day's property, a small dairy operation over near the state line. He walked it in his bare right hand. He photographed. He measured. He did not think all morning about the glove, or he thought he did not. Later, he was not so sure. When he came back to the truck at midday to eat the sandwich he had brought, the right glove was on the dashboard. It was folded on top of the left, the two gloves together, right on top of left, just as he had always kept them, just as they had been on the morning the left had first gone missing. He picked up the right glove. He turned it over. The small nicks from the barbed wire were gone. The dark sweat marks at the cuff were gone. The leather was clean and smooth and whole. It was a new glove in every visible way, only aged to match the shade of leather he had been wearing for 20 years. He put the glove in his coat pocket. He looked out at the dairy operation across the road. There was a woman on the porch of the farmhouse, hanging washing on a line. He watched her a while. She did not look toward him. She hung a sheet, a shirt, another sheet. The wind moved in her clothesline. She was, he told me, a perfectly ordinary woman in a perfectly ordinary morning, and he had never in his life so wanted to be a woman hanging washing on a line. He went home that night. He laid the new gloves out on the kitchen table. He looked at them a long time. He tried to remember, that night, whether there was any small detail of his old gloves that had not been perfectly reproduced in the new ones. There was not. They were identical, apart from the wear that had been removed. They were, in some way he could not quite frame in words, more his gloves than his gloves had been. He did not sleep well that night. Over the next months, other things went. His hat, his steel tape, his plumb bob, his Polaroid camera. Each of them left the truck in a way he could not account for, and each of them returned within a day, sitting where the old one had sat, folded or laid or set exactly as he had always set them, with every mark and stain and dent of a lifetime of use replaced by a soft and uncanny newness. His hat, when it came back, had the same small brown stain on the brim that a spilled cup of coffee had left in 1977. Only the stain now looked, when he examined it closely, less like a coffee stain than like a painting of a coffee stain, done from memory by a very patient hand. His plumb bob came back with the same nicks it had always had, each one in the right place, each one just slightly too regular to be a nick made by chance. He began that winter to keep 2 lists in the back of his brown notebook. On the left-hand page, he wrote every object of his own that had gone and come back. On the right-hand page, he tried to write down what was different about it. The lists grew. The right-hand page, over the months, filled with entries like too clean, too even, too perfect, too made. And underneath, in smaller letters, not mine, not mine, not mine. He did not tell anyone. What would he have said? To whom? He was, by then, a middle-aged county employee who lived alone above a hardware store in a town of 2,000 people. The nearest man he could have talked to who might have listened was a Catholic priest 3 counties over. And Wendell had not been to Mass since he was 9 years old, and he was not going to walk into a rectory now and tell a stranger that his gloves had been replaced by better gloves. So he lived with it. He worked. He measured. And he began, slowly, to feel a strangeness in his own hands. It started with the left thumb. The old tear in the glove had corresponded on his own hand to a small callus he had built up over the years from the way he gripped his clipboard. One morning in February, washing his hands at the sink, he noticed that the callus was gone. His left thumb was smooth. He turned his hand under the light. He rubbed the thumb with his other hand. The skin was soft. There was no callus. There was, so far as he could tell, no history of a callus. It was the thumb of a younger man. He looked in the mirror. He was still Wendell Rourke. Same gray hair, same close-set eyes, same nose broken in a schoolyard fight in 1952. Same face he had shaved every morning for 38 years. But his left thumb was not his thumb. Over the spring, more of him went that way. A small scar on the back of his right hand from a childhood dog bite. Gone one morning, the permanent yellow at the base of his left ring fingernail from a hammer he had dropped on it in 1981. Gone, a patch of rough skin on his right elbow from a lifetime of leaning on truck doors. Gone. He was, piece by piece, being replaced. He understood this by April. He wrote it in the notebook. He wrote, on a page all by itself, I am being replaced, slowly. From the outside in, he drove home that day. He sat on his little couch in the little apartment above the hardware store. He looked at his hands in the last of the evening light. They were his hands. They were good hands, honest hands, the hands of a man who had done careful work with them for a long time. But they were, he told me on the porch, no longer his hands. They were somebody else's idea of his hands. Somebody who had been watching him for a very long time and had made a study and was now producing, slowly and with great care, a replica. He asked himself, sitting there, the question that any man in his position must eventually ask, Trellhark. What happens when the replacement is done? He did not know the answer. He suspected he would not like the answer. He suspected the answer would come when the last unreplaced piece of him had been taken. and something else would sit up in his skin, and go about his life and file its measurements in the assessor's book, and read paperback mystery novels in the evening, and drink 1 glass of beer with its supper, and go to bed at 10. And no one, he told me, no one at all would know, because the replica would be perfect, because the replica had been made from 20 years of watching. He tried once to run. That was in June. He packed a small bag. He put the notebook in it. He got in the pickup at 3 in the morning, and he drove east. He drove for 4 hours. When the sun came up over the plains behind him, he stopped at a filling station in a small town he had never seen before. He got out to stretch his legs. He walked around the truck. He looked in through the driver's window. His hat was on the seat. His gloves were on the dashboard. His notebook was on the passenger seat, open to the page where he had written, "I am being replaced." He had not brought any of these things. He had left them all in the apartment. He was sure of it. He had checked. He had counted. He had made a list with pen on a piece of paper he had put in his shirt pocket of the things he had brought and the things he had left. He had left the hat. He had left the gloves. He had left the notebook. They were in the truck. He stood at the driver's window a long time. Behind him, the sun came up. The filling station lights flickered off. A man in overalls came out of the little station office and asked him if he needed anything, and Wendell said, "No, thank you," and got back in the truck and turned around and drove home. He drove the whole way with the hat on the seat beside him, and the gloves on the dashboard and the notebook on the passenger seat. And he did not touch any of them, and when he got home, he carried them up the stairs to his apartment and set them where they always sat, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he wrote in the notebook one more line. He wrote, "It does not want me to leave." That was the last entry. He did not stop working. He did not stop measuring. He did not stop keeping his careful lists. But he told me that night on the porch in Wichita that by the summer of 1994 he could count on the fingers of one of his, no longer quite his, hands the number of pieces of them that were still his own. The scar on his knee from a bicycle fall at 9, the small hollow in his lower back where his belt had rested for 40 years, the place on his skull, under his hair, where he had hit himself once on the corner of a barn door. A few small things, a few small proofs that he was still, somewhere, Wendell Rourke. He said quietly that these were going too. He said he could feel them going. He said he thought by fall, or by winter at the latest, there would be nothing left of him that had not been replaced. I asked him that night what he thought would happen after that. He shook his head. He said, "I don't know. I hope I go somewhere. I hope I don't just stop." Then he said, and I remember this exactly because it was the only time in 3 hours that his voice broke, "I hope when it walks around in me that it is at least kind to the people I have been kind to." He drank the last of the bourbon. He stood up. He shook my hand. His hand, I remember, was very smooth. It was the hand of a much younger man. He said good night, and he went inside, and I sat on the porch alone a long time after that. He died the following spring. I read about it in a small notice in a Kansas paper a cousin of mine mailed me clippings from. It said Wendell Rourke, county employee, had passed of a stroke at 54 in his sleep in his apartment above the hardware store. It said he had left no next of kin. It said he had been well liked by his co-workers. I do not know what to make of that, friend. I do not know whether it was Wendell who died, or whether it was the thing that had finished replacing him and had no further need of the imitation. I do not know whether Wendell went somewhere or whether Wendell just stopped. I have hoped over the years that he went somewhere. I have looked, sometimes, at my own hands in the last of the evening light. I have looked at the small scars, the callus on my writing finger, the old dark spot on the back of my left hand where a bit of the sun caught me one summer in the 60s and never quite let go. I have looked and I have counted and I have been reassured so far that everything I remember is still there, so far. That is a phrase, friend, that has come to do a lot of work in my life. Let me tell you a little more about the boarding house porch where Wendell told me this, friend, because the porch itself was part of why he told it. The boarding house was a big old 3-story clapboard on a side street in Wichita that had, in its better days, been the home of a cattle broker and his family, and had, in the intervening 70 years, been divided into rooms and let out to traveling men and county workers and old widowers who did not want to keep house anymore. It had a wide covered porch that ran the whole length of the front, with a row of white-painted rocking chairs and a small iron table between each pair. In the summer, the men who lived there sat out on that porch in the evenings and drank coffee or beer or, occasionally, something stronger, and they told each other the pieces of their lives that they had not been able to tell anywhere else. Wendell had come into Wichita that week for a training course the state was offering on new mapping equipment. He was staying at the boarding house because the county's per diem would not stretch to a hotel, and because he liked, he told me, the old kind of place where a man could sit outside in the evening without a television talking at him from every window. I was there for a different reason entirely, a nephew's wedding at a church across town, and had come in a day early and had, at the recommendation of the same cousin who would later mail me the newspaper clipping, taken a room at the boarding house for the night. We fell in together on the porch after supper. He had a paper sack. I had a pipe. The evening was warm and dry, and the crickets were starting up in the lot next door. We nodded to each other, and neither of us spoke for a good while, which is, in my experience, the surest sign that two men are going to end up telling each other something. He opened the bottle first. He offered me a cup, which I declined because I do not drink liquor and never have. He said, "Suit yourself," and poured himself 2 fingers into a small glass he had brought with him from his room. He took a slow swallow. He looked out at the street, where a young man was walking a bicycle past a row of dark storefronts. He said, without turning to me, "Do you believe in things you can't measure?" I said, "Some." He said, "I never used to," and I thought that would be all he'd say. But it was not. He talked then for the better part of 3 hours in a slow, steady voice, pausing every so often to take another swallow or to relight the little cigar he had produced from his shirt pocket, or to look out at the street when the young man with the bicycle passed the other way. He talked the way a man talks when he has been carrying a story for a long time and has finally found a stranger who will listen without asking him to prove any of it. I want to say one more thing about Wendell before I close this out, because it has stuck with me. In the middle of his telling, somewhere around the part about the notebook, he pulled the notebook itself out of his shirt pocket and set it on the little iron table between us. It was small, brown, spiral-bound, and worn soft at the corners the way a well-carried notebook gets worn. He did not open it. He just set it there. He said, "I brought this along in case I lost my nerve and needed to prove to myself I wasn't making it up." I did not ask to see inside it. I did not think it was my business. But when he had finished the story and the bottle was almost empty and the cicadas had gone quiet the way they do about 11, he pushed the notebook across the table to me. He said, "Would you take this?" He said, "When I get home, I'm going to want to burn it, and I don't think I should. I think somebody should have it, not to do anything with, just to have." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "I'm sure," he said. "If you don't mind, keep it somewhere safe. Don't read it, or read it if you want. I don't care anymore. Just don't leave it lying out where anybody could find it by accident." I took the notebook. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I told him I would keep it safe. He said, "Thank you." He said, "That's a load off." He finished his glass. We shook hands. He went inside. That was the last time I saw him. I still have the notebook, friend. It is in a small locked drawer in the desk across the room from where I am sitting right now. I have read it over the years. Every entry, every measurement, every date, every note in the right-hand column. Too clean, too even, too made. Not mine, not mine, not mine. The last entry, as I told you, was it does not want me to leave. But there is one more thing written in that notebook that I did not tell you about, and I will tell you now, and then I will let poor Wendell Rourke rest. On the very last page, after the last entry, in a different hand from the rest of the notebook, a hand that looks like Wendell's, but is a little too neat, a little too careful, the way a very good forgery is a little too careful. There is one final line. It was not there, I do not think, when he handed the notebook to me. Or if it was, I did not see it. I did not notice it for years. I noticed it one evening in the winter of 2001 when I opened the notebook for the first time in a while, and I turned all the way to the back, and I saw it. The line reads, "He is here now. He is fine. Do not worry about him." That is all. Nothing else. No signature. No date. I do not know who wrote it. I do not know when. I do not know whether it is a comfort or a threat. I have sat with it, on and off, for the better part of 25 years, and I have not decided. Some nights I think, well, whatever it was, at least it was kind enough at the end to leave a note. Some nights I think that. Other nights I do not think that. Rest easy tonight, friend. Wendell would have wanted somebody to. He was, at bottom, a kind man, whichever version of him you are counting. There is one more piece of Wendell's story, this story that I did not have room for the first time through, and it is the piece that has come back to me most often in the years since, and so I will tell it now. Somewhere in the middle of his telling, on that porch in Wichita, Wendell paused, and he refilled his little glass, and he said, "There is one thing I have not told anybody, and I would like to tell it to you if you will hear it." I said, "Of course." He said, "In the winter of '93, in January, I believe, on a very cold night, with the wind coming down off the plains, the way it comes down in that country, I woke up in the small hours and I could not sleep. I had been dreaming a thing I could not quite remember. I got up, I went into the kitchen, I put a kettle on, and while I was standing at the stove, waiting for it to sing, I looked out the little window over the sink, and I saw, in the alley 2 floors below, a man standing. He was standing under the street lamp at the mouth of the alley. He was wearing a khaki uniform shirt and a brown jacket and a hat I recognized. He had a clipboard in his hand, and he was looking up at my window. I did not move. I stood at the sink and I looked down at him and he looked up at me, and we looked at each other for what must have been a minute, though it felt longer. And then he raised his free hand and he waved. Not a big wave, a small polite wave. A wave, he said to me, that was more than anything else. The kind of wave you give a coworker when you pass him in a hallway you don't have time to stop in. This is you and me both getting through. The day wave. I did not wave back. I could not. I did not have the use of my hands just then. He put his hand down. He looked at me a moment longer. Then he turned around and he walked away down the alley, and he did not look back, and he went out of sight around the corner of the hardware store. I stayed at the window a long time. The kettle sang. I did not move to it. The kettle went on singing until the water was almost gone, and it began to smell of scorched metal. And only then did I take it off the burner, and only then did I sit down at the little table in the kitchen, and only then did I begin to shake. He said to me, sitting on that porch with the little cigar burned down almost to his fingers, that this was the moment he understood what was happening was not something that could be argued with, because up until then, he said, there was some small piece of him that had thought, well, maybe I am simply losing my mind. Maybe I am the sort of man who at 53 comes apart in a quiet way, and this glove business and this notebook business is only the shape my coming apart is taking. It would not have been a comfort, exactly, he said, but it would have been something. A man can live with losing his mind. Men do it every day, but standing at that window, looking down at himself in the alley, he understood that he was not losing his mind. The mind losing was, in fact, the easy and hopeful reading of his situation, and the easy and hopeful reading was no longer available to him. What was happening was happening. The other man was down there. The other man had waved. The other man had gone on about his business the way a man who lives in the same building as you goes on about his business, because the other man was, by then, sharing the building, was living somewhere, was, perhaps, waiting his turn. I asked him if he had ever seen the other man again after that. He said no, not once, not in the alley, not on the road, not in any window or any reflection or any picture. He said the other man had, so far as he could tell, only needed to be seen the once, that the waving had been a courtesy of a sort, that the whole business, from beginning to end, had had a strange low courtesy to it. Not warmth, but not cruelty either. It had been, he said, a very orderly haunting, a haunting that filled out its own paperwork. He appreciated that, he said, in a small, dark way. He was, after all, a county man. He respected paperwork. That was the piece he told me on the porch that I could not quite forget, that the whole business had felt orderly. That was the word he used. Orderly, as if what was happening to him was not an intrusion or an accident, but a procedure, as if somewhere, in some office he could not see, a form had been filled out with his name on it, and the form was being worked through, one line at a time, and the wave in the alley was simply the point at which one clerk had handed the file over to another, and the second clerk had wanted to lay eyes on the subject. I have thought about that word, orderly, on many nights since. It is not a word we usually use about a haunting, but it is, I think, the right word for what happened to Wendell Rourke, and it is the right word I have come to fear for a great many of the strangenesses in this world. They are not disorders. They are orders. They are procedures we cannot read. They are perhaps the paperwork of some office that has been open a long time and will be open a great deal longer. And every so often our names come up on the schedule, and when they do, clerk in a khaki shirt stands under a street lamp at 3 in the morning and gives us a small polite wave to let us know our file has moved. Rest easy now, friend. It is only a story. It is only a story a dying man told me on a porch in Wichita a long time ago. It is only one file, in one office. It is not, so far as we know, your file. Not tonight. Not this one. Story 5. This story sat in my journal for 40 years before I understood it. I wrote it down in the winter of 1982 from the telling of a man named August Merle, who was then in his 91st year and living in a nursing home outside Rutland, Vermont. He had been, in his working life, a clock repairman and a small dairyman on a maple sugar farm that had belonged to his family since before the Civil War, and he had lived through the Depression on that farm with his young wife. And it was of the winter of 1933 that he wanted to talk to me when I came up to see him for what would be the last time. Now listen close. This is how he told it, best as I can carry it forward. August Merle was 28 years old the winter this happened. He had married a girl named Ida Coulter 3 years earlier, and they had a son of 18 months named Peter, and they lived in a 2-story white farmhouse that sat on a small rise above a stand of sugar maples on the west edge of a valley in central Vermont. The farmhouse had been built by his grandfather in 1861 of hand-cut spruce timbers and hand-nailed clapboards, and it had stood through 72 Vermont winters when this story took place. And it looked, at that time, as though it had every intention of standing through 72 more. The Depression had come hard to that valley, as it had come hard to most of the country. But August and Ida had done better than most because they had land and animals and a sugar bush that produced enough syrup in a good March to see them through the rest of the year. They kept a small herd of Jerseys, a dozen chickens, a pair of workhorses, and a black and white farm dog named Sizzle, who slept in the kitchen and killed rats in the barn and knew, August told me, more about the running of the place than August did. The farmhouse had 6 rooms, a kitchen, a parlor, a small dining room they never used, a bedroom for August and Ida on the 2nd floor, a smaller bedroom that had been made into a nursery for Peter, and a spare bedroom at the back of the 2nd floor that they kept ready for visitors and used for storage in between. All of the windows were the original glass, wavy and full of small bubbles, the way glass from that era gets. The window in the parlor, the biggest one in the house, faced west across the sugar bush, and on winter evenings caught the last of the light coming across the ridge. That window is where this story lives. It was on a Thursday evening in early December that Ida first saw the face. She had put Peter down for his nap and had come into the parlor to sit by the stove and mend a sock. August was out in the barn, seeing to the cows. The light was going. She had lit one lamp and set it on the little table by her chair. She was working a wooden darning egg through the sock, humming to herself, when she happened to glance up at the window. There was a face pressed against the glass. It was, she told August that night, a man's face. Older, gray, very close to the glass. So close that the tip of the nose was actually touching it, and the breath from the mouth was making a small, pale bloom on the pane. The face was not looking at her. It was looking, past her, into the room. Its eyes were moving. They were moving slowly, taking in the parlor the way a man takes in a room he has come to consider buying. Ida did not scream. She was, August told me, not that kind of woman. She was a farm girl, and farm girls learn young that screaming does not usually solve anything and often makes things worse. She sat very still. She kept her hands on the darning. She kept her eyes on the face. And after a moment that seemed to her much longer than it was, the face at the window blinked once, slowly, and then withdrew. She got up. She walked to the window. There was nothing on the porch outside. There was no man in the yard. There were no footprints in the fresh snow that had fallen that afternoon. The pale bloom of breath on the inside of the pane, she noticed as she came close, was on the outside of the glass, not the inside, which was fine, except that a man's breath on the outside of a window in December in 12-degree weather does not stay on the glass for the 15 seconds it took her to cross a room. It goes to frost, or it goes to nothing. It does not stay as breath. This bloom stayed as breath. She watched it fade slowly over the next full minute, as though the breath that had produced it were only slowly finishing. She did not tell August that night. She thought about it, and she decided not to. He was tired. The barn work in winter was hard. The jerseys had a cough she was worried about. She did not want to add to what he was carrying. She told herself she had seen a shadow in the wavy glass, or an old memory made into a face by the light, or one of the small tricks that a tired woman's mind plays on her at the end of a long day. She went to bed. She slept. The face was there again the next night. This time she saw it from the kitchen, as she was setting the table for supper. It was pressed against a different window, the one over the sink. It was looking, as before, past her into the room. This time August was in the room too. He was at the pump, washing his hands, with his back to the window. She said, very quietly, "August, don't turn around fast. Just look at the window over the sink when you turn." August was a slow, careful man. He did not turn around fast. He finished washing his hands. He dried them on the towel by the pump. He turned around, easy as you please, and he looked at the window over the sink. He said, later, that he saw the face for perhaps 2 full seconds before it withdrew. He said he saw it very clearly. He said it was an older man's face, gray, with deep lines around the eyes and a slight downturn to the corners of the mouth. He said it looked, more than anything else, tired, not menacing, not angry, just tired, like a man who had walked a long way to get where he was and did not much look forward to walking back. The face saw him seeing it. Their eyes met for the last of those 2 seconds, and then the face withdrew. August went to the door. He put on his coat. He got the shotgun from the hook. He walked out into the yard. There was no one there. There was no one there. There were no tracks in the snow. There was nothing on the small kitchen porch outside the window. There was nothing under the window on the ground. The snow was smooth and unbroken all around the house, except for August's own tracks coming out from the door. He walked the whole perimeter. He checked the barn. He checked the woodshed. He checked the sugar house. He came back inside. He stood the shotgun by the door. He hung up his coat. He sat down at the table. Ida served him. They ate. Neither of them spoke about the face. That was Friday. Saturday night, the face was at the parlor window again. Sunday night, at the kitchen window. Monday, at the parlor window. Tuesday, at the small dormer window of the nursery, where Peter slept. It was the nursery window that broke August. He had gone up to check on the baby at about 7 in the evening. He had opened the door quiet so as not to wake him. Peter was asleep in the crib, breathing that particular breath that sleeping babies breathe. The room was dim, lit only by the small oil lamp Ida kept on the dresser. And across the room, at the little dormer window, was the face. It was pressed against the glass. It was looking down at the crib. August did not think. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He put himself between the crib and the window. He said, "Get away from my son." He did not shout it. He said it in a low, even voice, the way you speak to a strange dog. The face did not move. August said, "Get away." The face blinked. Slowly once, August reached up. He put his hand on the pane, directly over the face. The glass was cold. He said, in the same low voice, "If you come near my son again, I will find you and I will kill you." The face pulled back from the glass just an inch. It looked, for the first time, at August rather than past him. Its eyes were the color of an old nickel. It was, August told me, not the look of a man. It was the look of something wearing a man. He could not have told you how he knew this. He knew it. The face withdrew. It did not turn and walk away. It simply, in a way that August's mind could not quite hold on to, was not there anymore. August stood at the window a long time. Then he picked up the baby. He carried the baby downstairs. He handed the baby to Ida. He said, "We're all sleeping in the parlor tonight." He said, "Get whatever blankets you need." He got the shotgun. He nailed a quilt over the parlor window. He nailed a folded blanket over the smaller window that faced the back porch. He built the fire up high in the parlor stove. And the 3 of them, husband and wife and 18-month-old son, made a small camp on the parlor floor that night. And August sat up with the shotgun across his knees, and Ida slept in fits, and Peter slept the way babies sleep, and the wind moved in the sugar bush outside, and nothing came to the window. In the morning, they made a plan. They would go to Ida's mother's house down in the village. They would leave that afternoon. They would take Peter and Sizzle the dog, and what few things they could carry, and they would come back in the spring, and they would deal with this then. Whatever this was, in the daylight, they packed. Ida packed the baby's things. August hitched the workhorses to the sleigh. Sizzle, who was normally a placid dog, paced in the kitchen and would not settle, and whined at the front door, and would not go near any window. August loaded the sleigh. He came back inside. He said, "Ida, time to go." There was no answer. He went into the parlor. Ida was standing at the parlor window. The quilt was still nailed over it. She was standing with her back to the window, facing him, her hands folded in front of her. Her eyes were open. She was looking at him. She said, "August, I want to stay a little longer." He said, "Ida, we're going." She said, "I want to stay." He said, "Ida, where is Peter?" She said, "Upstairs, in his crib." Sleeping August did not run. He walked in the slow, careful way he did everything, past his wife and out of the parlor and up the stairs and into the nursery. Peter was in his crib. He was awake. He was looking up at the small dormer window, and he was smiling. It was the smile of a baby who is being played with by someone he likes. There was no one at the window. August picked up his son. He carried him downstairs. He walked past the parlor. Ida was still at the window. She had not moved. She was watching him with her head turned. She said, "August, please." A little longer. He did not answer. He put on his coat. He carried Peter out to the sleigh. He wrapped Peter in the buffalo robe. He whistled for Sizzle. The dog would not come. August whistled again. The dog stayed at the front door. Looking into the house, whining, August went back in. He went to the parlor. He said, "Ida, come to the sleigh." She said, "August, if you make me leave this house today, I will not forgive you." Her voice was her voice. Her face was her face. Her eyes were her eyes. She looked, in every particular, like Ida Merle, 26 years old, standing in her own parlor in the morning light of a December Wednesday in 1933. But her hands, folded in front of her, were folded in a way Ida's hands did not fold. Thumbs were on the outside. Ida's thumbs, when she folded her hands, were always on the inside. He had watched her fold her hands 10,000 times. He knew. He said, "Ida, show me your left hand." She said, "Why?" He said, "Show me." She raised her left hand, slowly. On the ring finger was Ida's wedding ring, simple gold band, small nick on one side from a barn door in 1931. Exactly Ida's ring. He had bought it. He had put it on her finger himself. He said, "Ida, what was the name of the horse we had when we got married?" She said, "August." "Come on, we should go." He said, "What was the name?" She did not answer. He said, one more time, "The horse, our first horse." The name. She smiled, a very small smile. It was almost Ida's smile. It was, he told me, close enough that if he had not just watched the thumbs, he would have gone to her. He would have crossed the room and taken her in his arms. And he would have said he was sorry, and they would have stayed a little longer, and Peter would have grown up in that house with whatever it was that was becoming his mother, and August himself would have gone at last to the parlor window and looked at what was on the other side of it and pressed his own face against the glass. But he had watched the thumbs. He said, "Ida, I am going to go outside now with Peter. I am going to drive down to your mother's. I am going to leave the door unlocked. If you are my wife, you can come after us any time. If you are my wife, I love you, and I will come back for you tomorrow." She said nothing. She only looked at him. He turned around. He walked out of the parlor. He walked to the front door. He whistled to the dog. Sizzle, this time, came. August closed the door behind him. He did not lock it. He got in the sleigh. He held Peter close. He turned the horses out of the yard, and he drove down the long, slow track to the road, and he did not look back at the house. He got to Ida's mother's house about 4 in the afternoon. He told her mother that Ida was still up at the farm. He said Ida had wanted to stay a little longer. He said he would go back for her in the morning. Ida's mother was a sharp old woman, and she looked at him hard, and she took the baby from his arms, and she said, "All right, August." In the morning, that night in Ida's mother's kitchen, with Peter asleep on a pallet by the stove and the dog under the table, August drank a whole pot of coffee and did not sleep. At about 3 in the morning, he heard a scratching at the kitchen door. He got up. He went to the door. He opened it. Ida was standing on the porch. She was in her nightgown. She was barefoot. She had walked, apparently, the 6 miles down from the farm through the snow. Her feet were bloody. Her eyes were wild. She said, "Oh, God, August. Oh, God, I didn't know. I woke up in the parlor, and everything was cold, and I thought, where is my baby? Where is my baby?" He took her inside. He wrapped her in a blanket. She wept. She said she remembered nothing since Tuesday. She remembered being in the kitchen making supper on Tuesday. And she remembered looking up and seeing August in the doorway, saying it was time to eat. And then nothing, until she had woken up in the parlor, in the dark of Wednesday night, alone in the house, and she had understood in some deep, wordless way that she had to get out, and she had gone. She said, "August, I don't know what happened to me." He said, "I don't either." He said, "We're not going back to that house." And they did not. Not that winter, not the following spring, not ever. They lived out the winter at Ida's mother's, and in the spring, August went back up the track alone with two men from the village, and they collected what could be collected, and they closed the house up, and they nailed the doors and the windows shut with pine boards, and they left it. August and Ida moved to a small place on the other side of the village. They had two more children. They lived long, mostly happy lives. Peter grew up. Peter went to war. Peter came home. Peter had children of his own. The house on the rise stayed empty. The sugar bush went unworked for a generation. Every so often, hunters or hikers passing through the valley would report seeing a light in one of the upstairs windows at dusk, though the house had no electricity and no one had lit a lamp there in 40 years. Every so often, someone would go up the track to look and find nothing and come back down. The house was still standing when August Merle told me this story in the winter of 1982. He asked me, when I came up to visit him, if I would do him one small favor after he was gone. He asked me to go up the track, when I could, and to look at the parlor window from the yard, and to tell him, when I saw him again on the other side, whether the face was still there. I said I would. I did not, for many years, keep that promise. Life took me many places. August passed in the spring of 1983. His son Peter passed some years after that. Ida had gone before either of them, quiet and old, in her own bed, still with all her thumbs on the inside. I went up the track, at last, in the autumn of 2001. I was in the state for other reasons. I found the old farm road. I walked it. The house was still standing. The pine boards were still nailed over the doors and the windows. The sugar bush had gone wild. There were young maples growing right up against the parlor wall. I stood in the yard in the last of the afternoon light. I looked at the parlor window. The pine board that had been nailed over it on the inside was still there. I could see it through the wavy glass. And in front of the pine board, on the inside of the glass, pressed close against it, was a face. Older, gray, very tired. It was August Merle's face. It was looking past me, out at the yard. It was watching, I understood, the sugar bush and the ridge, and the last of the light coming across from the west. It did not seem to see me, or if it did not think I was worth acknowledging. I stood there a long time. The face did not move. I do not know if it ever moved. Eventually the light went out of the sky, and I could not see the face any more in the darkness of the pane, and I turned and walked back down the track to my truck, and I drove away. I have not gone back. I do not intend to, but I have kept the promise, friend, as best I could. If August is on the other side by now, and if the other side has a way of hearing us, I hope he hears this and knows the face is still there. I do not think it is him. I think it is what was pressed against the glass all those winters ago when it wanted to come in, and what finally came in when he was old, or when he was dying, or when he was sleeping the sleep before he died. I think it wore his face for a while and looked out through his window, and it is looking out still. I do not know what it wants. I do not know what it is watching for. I do not know if it will ever, in the long, slow arithmetic of whatever it is doing, be done watching. I know only that if you ever find yourself on a Vermont road at dusk, and you pass an old farmhouse boarded up on a small rise above a wild sugar bush, and you feel a small cold curiosity to turn your car up the track and go look at it, you should not. There is a face at the window. It is a very tired face. It has been watching for a very long time, and if it turns to look at you, friend, do not raise your hand to wave. Do not smile. Do not linger. Get back in your car. Drive away. Do not stop until you are in a town with a street lamp and a diner and a waitress pouring coffee for somebody else. And when you get home tonight and you lock your door and you draw your curtains, draw them all the way. Not almost all the way, all the way. There are things, friend, that only need the smallest crack of glass to press their face against. And once a face has pressed itself against your glass, it does not forget the address. Leap easy now. My voice will be here a while yet. The fire is still burning. The rain is still on the roof. There is nothing at your window tonight. Nothing at all. Let me tell you a little more about that valley, friend. Because place matters in a story like this, and the valley itself was part of what happened. The valley where the Merle farm sat was one of those long, narrow Vermont valleys that runs north to south with a small river at the bottom of it and a ridge on either side, and the road up the west side of the valley was a rutted dirt track that turned to mud in April and to iron in January and to something in between the rest of the year. The village at the south end of the valley had a population of 211 people at the time of this story, according to the last census that anybody had bothered to take. It had a general store, a congregational church, a 2-room schoolhouse, and a blacksmith. It did not have a doctor. The nearest doctor was 11 miles south, over the ridge, in a bigger town called Prescott. In the winter, when the ridge road drifted in, the nearest doctor might as well have been in Boston. August Merle had grown up in that valley. His father had grown up in it. His grandfather had come up out of Connecticut in 1859, bought the piece of land on the rise, cut the timbers for the house from his own trees, and put up the farm in 1861. It was the only home August had ever known. He had gone away from it exactly twice in his life before the winter of 1933. Once, at 14, to spend a summer with an uncle in Massachusetts. Once, at 19, when the war had almost taken him but had ended 2 weeks before he was to ship out. Both times he had come home to the farm with the deep, quiet relief of a man returning to the only shape his life could hold. He had known every foot of that land. He had known the sugar bush the way a man knows the pattern of veins on the back of his own hand. He had known from 100 small childhood observations where the deer trails ran through the second growth on the west slope, where the first mayflowers came up in the spring, where the vein of quartz ran through the outcrop at the top of the ridge. He had known the house the same way. Every warped board of the floor, every knot in the pine of the doors, every small draft in every window, and he had never once, in 28 years, seen a face pressed against a window of that house. That was, he told me, on the last afternoon I sat with him at the nursing home, the part he had never been able to shake. He said, in a quiet voice, I lived in that house all my life. I knew that house. I would have staked anything I had on the fact that no face had ever been at any of those windows, from the outside, uninvited, in the 72 years the house had stood before that Thursday in December. And then in 1 week, it was at every window, every one but the spare bedroom at the back. It never showed up at the spare bedroom. I have wondered why all my life. I asked him what he thought. He said, I think it was already inside the spare bedroom. He said this very simply, without emphasis, as an old man tells you a small truth he has been carrying a long time. He said, I think there was a room in my house I did not know about, or I think there was a way into my house I did not know about, and it came in through the spare bedroom, and it looked out through my other windows, and what I saw pressed against the glass was not a man trying to get in from outside. It was a man in my own spare bedroom, pressing his face against the inside of the glass, looking out, looking at whatever it was looking at. And what it was looking at, most of the time, was my wife. And then my son. I asked him what he thought it wanted. He said, I do not think it wanted anything. I think it lived there. I think it had always lived there. I think my grandfather built a house around it in 1861 without knowing, and I think for 72 years it had waited, in whatever quiet room of the house it lived in, for whatever it was waiting for. And I think it decided in the winter of 1933 that it was ready to look out. He said quietly, I think if we had stayed, it would have looked out through my wife next. That was what the thumbs told me. The thumbs told me it had already reached her. I think one more day, maybe two, and I would have come home to a house that looked like my house, chark, with a wife in it that looked like my wife, and a baby in a crib upstairs that looked like my baby, and the three of us would have gone on for a while, and the face would have gone from the windows, because it would have been settled in, and there would not have been any more trouble at all. That, he said, is the part that has kept me awake most. Not the face at the window, the quiet after the face at the window, the quiet that would have come if I had not watched the thumbs. He looked at me a long time then. He said, I have thought all my life about the people whose spouses do not fold their hands quite right, whose husbands do not remember the name of the first horse, whose wives do not smile quite the way they used to. I have thought about all the small wrong things a person might notice about the person they love and shrug at and let go. I have thought that some of those small wrong things are only what happens when two people get older together, and I have thought that some of them are not. He said, I do not know how you tell the difference. I got lucky. The thumbs were the tell for me, but the tell will not be the same for everybody. There will be, I think, a tell for everybody. Small wrong detail, a hand folded the wrong way, a word said in a voice that is almost the voice. If you love somebody, friend, watch. Watch closely. Watch every day, because whatever is at the window is patient, and it has been patient for a very long time, and it will come in through whatever door it can find. That is what he told me that last afternoon in the nursing home outside Rutland. He passed a few weeks later, peaceful, in his sleep. I hope, friend, that when he passed cleanly and went where he was going, and did not stay behind in any window in any old boarded-up house on a rise above a wild sugar bush in central Vermont. I hope so. But when I stood in that yard in 2001, and I looked up at the parlor window, and I saw the face there, and I understood that the face was his face, I could not help but wonder whether he had stayed, whether he had gone up the track one last time, in whatever way an old man goes, and had pressed himself against the parlor glass and had taken the watch, because he had promised at the end of his life that he would tell me if the face was still there. And there is more than one way for a man to keep a promise. There is looking out at a yard to see if a face is at the window. And there is being the face at the window. I hope the second is not what he did. But I have wondered. Rest easy now, friend. Let it be a story. Let it be one man's tale from long ago, told to another man in a nursing home, and told again by that man to you tonight by a fire in the rain. Let the face at the window be only a face in a story. Let it stay in the story, and not follow the story out of the story, and not come to your window tonight or any night. Let August Merle be where he wanted to be, wherever that is. Let his wife Ida be with him. Let their son Peter and Peter's children and Peter's children's children live their long, ordinary lives without knowing what almost happened in a farmhouse in December of 1933. And let you, friend, sleep easy. There is one more small thing to say tonight, and then I will let you go. The fire's just about burned down to embers now, friend. The rain's still coming, soft on the roof, the way it will keep coming till morning. If you're still awake, close your eyes now. Let the room go dark. Let my voice go small. If you drifted off somewhere in the middle of one of these stories, well, I hope you dreamed of nothing at all. I'll be here tomorrow night. Same chair, same fire, same rain on the same tin roof. Come back and we'll tell some more. Rest easy tonight. Sleep well, friend.